My name is Jessica. I am 28 years old and I am a forensic accountant. Just hours after my grandfather was lowered into the ground, my stepmom leaned close to me and whispered that her golden boy son was finally going to inherit the luxury business. She smirked and told me I was nothing but grandpa's little girl. My own father stood right beside her and stayed completely quiet. But they had absolutely no idea that the very next morning, a lawyer would walk into our living room with a single sealed document and announce that the entire empire was always meant for me. Their confident smiles vanished as the blood drained entirely from their faces. Before I dive into exactly how I took back my legacy and threw them out with nothing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who tried to erase your worth. Growing up in Chicago, I learned early on that family loyalty usually came with a heavy price tag. My grandfather Theodore was my entire world. He was a brilliant man who founded Sterling Timepieces, a highly lucrative luxury vintage watch restoration and appraisal firm right in the heart of the city. He built a multi-million-dollar empire out of magnifying glasses, tiny gears, and pure dedication. I spent my childhood sitting under his workbench, mesmerized by the ticking of antique watches. While other kids played outside, I learned how to spot a counterfeit dial and how to balance a complex financial ledger. I adored him, and he was the only person in our cold house who saw my true value. But to my father and my stepmom Linda, I was completely invisible. When my father married Linda, she brought her own son Tyler into the home and immediately crowned him the prince of the family. While I was pushed into the shadows to study numbers and auditing, Tyler was relentlessly groomed to take over the business. My father allowed Linda to turn me into a ghost. I became a sharp forensic accountant tracking hidden money for massive corporate clients, but at the dinner table, I was still treated like the hired help. When Grandpa Theodore passed away last week, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The house felt terribly empty, but Linda and Tyler did not shed a single genuine tear. They were too busy calculating their impending wealth and measuring the corner office. They treated my grandfather's tragic death like a massive lottery win. They assumed my quiet nature meant I was weak, and that my career meant I lacked the vision to run Sterling Timepieces. They severely miscalculated. They thought they could simply step over my grief and claim the keys to the kingdom without a single fight. They forgot that I make my living exposing liars. The freezing wind ripped across the Chicago cemetery, cutting through my thin black coat, but the cold outside was absolutely nothing compared to the ice forming in my chest. I stood a few feet away from the open grave, watching the polished mahogany casket, holding my grandfather slowly lower into the earth. With every single inch, it dropped, a massive piece of your heart went down with it. He was the only man who had ever truly loved me, the only person in our household who saw my potential and nurtured my mind. Across the grave, my stepmother Linda dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a pristine white tissue, putting on the tragic performance of a lifetime for the distant relatives and wealthy business associates gathered around us. She sniffled loudly and leaned heavily against my father William, who patted her shoulder with practiced devotion. For 15 years, I had watched her play this exact role, the devoted wife, the caring matriarch, while methodically and viciously erasing my existence from our family home. But the second the priest finished his final prayer, the heartbreaking act abruptly ended. The mourning crowd began to respectfully disperse, retreating toward their heated luxury cars and the promise of warm shelter. I stayed rooted to the spot, staring down at the fresh, damp earth. That was when I felt Linda step aggressively into my personal space. The cloying, heavy scent of her expensive designer perfume completely overpowered the natural smell of the damp grass. She did not offer a comforting hug or a single word of sympathy to a grieving granddaughter. Instead, she leaned in dangerously close until her lips were practically brushing against my ear. Her voice lost all trace of the weeping widow and dropped into a sharp, venomous whisper that I will never forget. Finally, my son is going to inherit the luxury business. You are just Grandpa's little girl, honey. The sheer sudden cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. She was not just celebrating her impending wealth, she was actively gloating over the death of the only person who protected me. She pulled back and looked at me with a triumphant, mocking smirk, her eyes practically gleaming with the eager anticipation of kicking me out of the company my grandfather and I loved so much. I snapped my head up and looked directly at my father. He was standing less than 2 feet away from us. He had heard every single word she just said. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine, and I searched desperately for a spark of defense, for a tiny hint of the brave man who used to read me bedtime stories before Linda entered our lives and took control. But just like he had done for the past 15 agonizing years, William simply looked away. He shifted his weight, stared down at his expensive leather shoes, and shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets. His silence was deafening. It was the exact same cowardly silence that allowed Linda to throw out my childhood belongings, the same silence that permitted her son Tyler to take the large bedroom meant for me, the same silence that slowly stripped away my fundamental right to be called his daughter. He was a coward enabling her emotional abuse because it was always easier for him than standing up for his own flesh and blood. My throat tightened with a familiar burning ache, but I absolutely refused to let them see me cry. As if Linda's venom was not enough, her son Tyler was already making his move just a few yards away. He was standing near a large marble mausoleum, talking incredibly loudly on his cell phone, completely oblivious to the solemn, respectful surroundings. Tyler had never worked a hard day in his entire life, preferring to spend his time at exclusive country clubs and lavish parties funded entirely by my father's drained bank account. Now, he was loudly bragging to a friend about his immediate plans for sterling timepieces. I could hear his arrogant, booming voice echoing over the quiet graves. "Yeah, we are completely gutting the old man's vintage workshop." He laughed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "All those dusty wooden workbenches and rusty antique tools are going straight into the dumpster today. I'm bringing in luxury contractors next week to tear down the walls and build a modern VIP lounge with neon lighting and a massive wet bar. That is how you run a real luxury brand." He was openly talking about erasing my grandfather's meticulous legacy before the man was even fully buried. That workshop was sacred ground to me. It was where my grandfather patiently taught me how to clean a delicate escapement, where we spent hundreds of quiet hours bonding over the intricate mechanical hearts of century-old watches. Tyler wanted to turn a revered institution of horology into a cheap, flashy nightclub to impress his superficial friends who would not know a mainspring from a simple paperclip. My fists clenched so tightly, my nails dug half-moons deep into my palms. But Tyler was not standing alone. Right next to him was his wife, Jasmine. Jasmine was a fiercely intelligent African-American woman who had built her own highly successful luxury real estate brokerage completely from the ground up. She was entirely self-made, navigating a ruthless corporate industry through sheer grit, and she deeply respected people who actually earned their keep. She had always been quietly polite to me, but we kept our distance, mostly because being close to me meant crossing paths with Linda. But right now, Jasmine's stunning face was a tight mask of absolute, unhidden disgust. She clearly found Tyler's grave dancing completely repulsive. While Tyler continued to loudly brag about tearing down a legacy he did not build, Jasmine abruptly reached out and grabbed his arm. Her grip was visibly tight, her posture rigid with intense secondhand embarrassment. "Tyler, shut your mouth and show some respect." She hissed, her voice dangerously low and freezing cold. "You are at a funeral, for God's sake." Tyler simply rolled his eyes violently, yanking his arm away from her firm grasp. "Relax, Jasmine. It is just business," he muttered dismissively, waving his hand in the air as if batting away a bothersome fly. He turned his back on his own wife and walked toward the waiting limousines, completely ignoring the sharp, furious glare she shot at the back of his head. For a fleeting moment, Jasmine looked over at me. Her expression softened just a fraction, carrying a complex mix of pity and quiet understanding, before she turned and walked to her own car alone. I stood there in the freezing rain, surrounded by the exact people who were supposed to be my family, realizing they were already planning my permanent exile from the company. But they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. The very next morning, The sprawling Chicago estate felt less like a house of mourning and entirely like the VIP lounge of a high-end casino. I arrived at 9:00 sharp, parking my modest sedan far down the long, sweeping driveway behind a line of luxury vehicles. Walking through the heavy oak front doors, my stomach churned with a mixture of profound grief and sheer anxiety. The scent of funeral lilies still hung heavily in the air, but it was completely overpowered by the smell of expensive catered bacon and freshly squeezed orange juice. Linda had orchestrated a lavish catered breakfast spread across the grand mahogany dining table. She was floating around the room in a tailored black designer dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a day of mourning. In her hand, she held a crystal pitcher of freshly poured mimosas, laughing brightly as she filled up glasses. The sheer disrespect was suffocating. My grandfather had not even been in the ground for 24 hours, and she was already throwing a victory party. Tyler was standing by the massive stone fireplace, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, looking every bit the arrogant heir apparent. He was holding a crystal flute of champagne and loudly gesturing as he spoke to one of his country club friends on speakerphone. He was already making promises about executive board seats and discussing which of my grandfather's senior watchmakers he planned to fire first to cut costs. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed the world owed him a throne he had never worked a single day to build. Sitting a few feet away on a leather sofa was his wife, Jasmine. She was dressed in a sharp, conservative black suit, holding a simple mug of black coffee. Jasmine did not touch the mimosas or the catered pastries. As a self-made real estate broker who clawed her way to the top of the Chicago market, she understood the value of hard work. She watched Tyler with a cold, calculating gaze, her posture rigid with silent judgment. When I walked into the room, Jasmine gave me a brief, completely unreadable nod before turning her attention back to her coffee. My father, William, was standing near the large bay windows, looking out at the meticulously manicured gardens. He held a plate of food he was not eating, his shoulders slumped in that familiar posture of defeat. He looked like a guest in his own home. When he saw me enter, he quickly looked down at his shoes, completely avoiding my eyes. It was a cowardly habit I had come to expect. He had spent the last 15 years trading his backbone for peace and quiet, allowing Linda to slowly, systematically erase me from the family. He knew exactly how much my grandfather meant to me. He knew I had spent thousands of hours in the vintage workshop learning the intricate mechanics of luxury timepieces while Tyler was busy failing his college courses. Yet, my father chose to stand in the corner, clutching a plate of cold eggs, while his wife prepared to steal my legacy. I took a deep breath and stood near the doorway, refusing to take a seat at their celebratory table. Precisely at 9:30, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. The jovial chatter in the room instantly died down. Linda practically sprinted to the door, smoothing her dress and pasting on a brilliant, welcoming smile. She opened it to reveal attorney David Vance. David was a formidable man in his late 50s with sharp graying hair and a tailored charcoal suit. He had been my grandfather's personal estate lawyer and trusted confidant for over 2 decades. He knew the inner workings of sterling timepieces better than anyone besides my grandfather and me. David walked into the foyer carrying a thick leather briefcase, his expression completely stoic and unreadable. Linda immediately swooped in, gesturing grandly toward the lavish breakfast spread. "David, thank you so much for coming," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Please come in and sit down. I had the caterers set up a wonderful brunch for us. Would you like a mimosa or perhaps some fresh coffee before we get down to the business of officially transferring the company?" David stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the crystal glasses, the champagne, and then directly into Linda's eyes. His face remained an absolute mask of professional detachment. "No, thank you, Linda," he said, his voice firm and completely devoid of warmth. "I am here strictly in a professional capacity to execute Theodore Sterling's final wishes. I will not be staying for breakfast. We should proceed immediately to the reading." Linda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. "Of course," she chirped, waving her hand toward the massive dining table. "Let us all sit down." "Tyler, darling, come take your seat at the head of the table. You're the man of the house now." Tyler puffed out his chest and strutted over to the large leather armchair at the head of the mahogany table, literally claiming my grandfather's seat. He sat down, heavily adjusting his expensive silk tie, and leaned back with a smug, satisfied smirk. Linda took the seat immediately to his right, hovering over him like a protective hawk. My father quietly slid into a chair at the far end, keeping his head down. Jasmine chose a seat near the back wall, deliberately distancing herself from her husband's arrogant display. I walked over and stood quietly behind one of the empty chairs, choosing not to sit. I wanted to remain on my feet. David Vance took his place at the opposite end of the table, facing Tyler. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on the polished wood. The distinctive click of the metal latches popping open echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, pristine white envelope, secured with a heavy red wax seal. Everyone in the room stared at that envelope. Tyler leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, practically salivating at the sight of it. David adjusted his reading glasses and picked up a silver letter opener. With a smooth, practiced motion, he sliced through the heavy paper, breaking the red wax seal. The tearing sound seemed to suck all the remaining air right out of the room. He withdrew a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He cleared his throat and looked around the room, locking eyes with each of us for a brief moment before focusing on the pages. "This is the last will and testament of Theodore Sterling." David began, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "It was executed 3 months ago under my supervision and witnessed by 2 independent medical professionals, confirming his complete mental clarity." Linda nodded enthusiastically, gripping Tyler's arm. Yes, of course," she interrupted. Theodore was perfectly clear-headed when he finally realized Tyler was the only one capable of taking sterling timepieces into the modern era. "Please, David, skip the formalities and get to the executive transfer. Tyler has contractors waiting to hear from him this afternoon." David did not even blink at her rude interruption. He simply looked down at the document and continued reading at his own deliberate, measured pace. He started with the minor bequests. He read off small sums of money donated to various historical societies and a few local charities my grandfather supported. He bequeathed his vintage car collection to a trusted old friend. He left my father a modest cash sum and the deed to a small vacation cabin in Michigan. Tyler was visibly bouncing his leg under the table, completely impatient, sighing loudly as David meticulously read through the secondary assets. Tyler did not care about charity or family cabins. He only cared about the multi-million-dollar crown jewel. Finally, David turned to the last page of the document. The room fell so incredibly silent, you could hear the rain starting to softly hit the tall glass windows. Article 7. David read, his voice suddenly growing louder and infinitely more commanding. "Regarding the entirety of my business assets, intellectual property, and all controlling shares of sterling timepieces." Tyler sat up perfectly straight, wiping a hand across his mouth. Linda leaned in so close her chin was practically resting on the mahogany table. My father looked up, for the very first time, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. David took a slow, deliberate breath and read the exact, unalterable legal phrasing my grandfather had carefully constructed. "To my legal heir, I leave the absolute sum of my life's work. I hereby bequeath 100% of all voting shares, full executive control the entire vintage inventory, and complete undisputed ownership of sterling timepieces exclusively to my granddaughter Jessica Sterling." For one terrifying, agonizing second, the universe simply stopped spinning. The words hung suspended in the heavy air. 100%, exclusively to Jessica. The crystal champagne flute slipped right out of Linda's manicured fingers. It hit the solid marble floor with a violent, deafening crash, sending shards of glass and expensive champagne exploding across the room. She did not even look down. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly chalk white as her jaw dropped completely open in sheer, unadulterated shock. Tyler violently shoved his heavy chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the floor as he shot to his feet, his face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "That is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "That is a pathetic, absolute lie. You read that wrong." He promised me the company. He promised my mother. That document is a total forgery. I demand you let me see that paper right now." Tyler slammed his fist down on the dining table, making the silverware rattle violently. My father jumped backward in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sudden explosion of rage. Jasmine remained absolutely frozen in her seat, but her eyes narrowed into sharp, calculating slits, closely watching her husband completely lose his mind like a spoiled toddler denied a toy. I stood completely still, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained an emotionless mask. My grandfather had done it. He had actually protected me. David Vance did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or argue with the screaming grown man throwing a tantrum at the head of the table. With chilling, absolute calmness, David tapped the stack of papers against the mahogany wood, aligning the edges perfectly. He slipped the will into a protective blue folder. He placed the folder back into his heavy leather briefcase and snapped the metal latches shut with a resounding final click. "You rigged this." Tyler continued to scream, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You manipulated a dying old man, you scheming little accountant. I will tie this up in court for decades. I will have him declared mentally unfit. You will never see a single dime of that company." David picked up his briefcase by the handle and turned slowly to face Tyler. The seasoned lawyer looked dead into the arrogant eyes of the man who thought he could simply steal a legacy. "You can try, Tyler," David said, his voice dangerously low and completely unshakable. But Theodore subjected himself to 3 separate cognitive evaluations the week he signed this. It is ironclad, bulletproof, and effective immediately. David turned and began walking toward the grand foyer. Linda finally found her voice, letting out a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "David, wait! You cannot do this! Tyler is the son of this family. He is the future." David stopped with his hand resting on the heavy, brass doorknob. He did not turn around to look at her. He simply looked straight ahead out the small glass window of the door and delivered the killing line with devastating, absolute finality. It was always meant for her. David opened the door and walked out into the cold Chicago morning, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The loud, heavy thud of the door closing sealed our fates. He left the room in absolute, suffocating silence. Tyler stood trembling with rage, breathing heavily through his teeth. Linda stared at the shattered glass, pulling at her feet, completely broken and humiliated. My father stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the daughter he threw into the shadows had just become the most powerful person in the room. The war had officially begun, and I was already holding the winning hand. The heavy oak doors of the dining room clicked shut behind the lawyer, leaving an unnatural stillness in the grand hallway. I stood there, letting the reality of my grandfather's final act of love wash over me. For my entire life, I had been treated like a shadow in this house, a ghost that only existed to serve the needs of my stepmother Linda and her golden child Tyler. But my grandfather had seen me. He handed me the entire empire because he knew I was the only one who truly respected his legacy. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of grief and unexpected vindication. That was when I heard the frantic shuffling of footsteps behind me. I turned to see my father, William, rushing out of the dining room. His face was flushed red, and his tie was slightly crooked. For a brief, foolish second, a tiny part of me hoped he was coming to finally acknowledge my worth. Instead, he lunged forward and grabbed my elbow with a desperate, panicky grip, pulling me aggressively toward the antique console table tucked away in the shadowy alcove of the hall. He did not offer a single word of comfort. His eyes were darting nervously back toward the closed dining room doors, like a frightened animal worried that his demanding wife might catch him failing at his assigned task. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket with trembling fingers and pulled out a sharply creased piece of paper. He slammed it down onto the polished surface of the console table and shoved a gold pen into my hand. It was a formal renunciation of inheritance form, hastily printed and practically reeking of Linda's frantic desperation. My father looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, completely ignoring the absolute betrayal etched across my face. He wanted me to sign away the complete ownership of sterling timepieces right there in the hallway before the ink on the lawyer's copy was even fully dry. "Jesse, you have to fix this," he pleaded, his voice dropping into a harsh, frantic whisper. You know your grandfather was not thinking clearly at the end. He made a terrible mistake. You cannot possibly take this company from your brother. Tyler has been preparing for this role his entire life. He knows the luxury market, and he knows how to network with the right elite clients. My father leaned closer heavily, relying on the same paternal authority he had used to crush my spirit for 15 years. You are just an accountant, Jesse. You sit behind a desk and crunch numbers. You do not understand the sheer vision and aggressive charisma it takes to run a multi-million-dollar brand. Tyler is a visionary. He has massive plans to modernize the entire operation. You keeping this business will completely destroy our family. Linda is practically hyperventilating in there. Just sign the form, Jesse. Be the bigger person and do this for the family. Let Tyler take the wheel and we can all move on. I stared down at the piece of paper, completely disgusted by the sheer audacity of the man standing in front of me. The toxic weight of his manipulation pressed down on my shoulders, demanding that I shrink myself yet again to accommodate a boy who had never worked a single hard day in his entire life. My father truly believed I would just roll over and surrender my grandfather's life work to keep his fragile, miserable marriage intact. But something profound and unbreakable had shifted deep inside my chest when the lawyer read that final clause. I was no longer the scared 13-year-old girl begging for a scrap of affection from a man who had chosen a new wife over his own flesh and blood. I looked at the gold pen resting in my palm and felt a sudden intense wave of absolute clarity. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I slowly pushed the paper back across the polished wood of the console table, looking my father dead in his desperate eyes. I am not signing anything. I said, my voice completely steady and stripped of any remaining childhood fear. My father physically recoiled as if I had just slapped him across the face. "Jesse, please," he stammered, but I cut him off immediately. "Do not insult my intelligence by calling Tyler a visionary." I fired back my words, hitting the quiet hallway like sharp stones. "Your precious visionary completely failed out of business school 3 separate times while blowing your retirement savings on country club memberships. He does not even know the difference between a balance sheet and a profit margin. Meanwhile, I am the only reason Sterling Timepieces did not go bankrupt during the recession. For 6 grueling years, I sat at my desk until 3 in the morning, doing the company's corporate taxes completely for free because you and Linda had bled the operating accounts dry to fund your lavish vacations. I caught the massive financial leaks and restructured the debt. I literally kept the lights on in Grandpa's workshop while your golden boy was busy nursing hangovers on a Tuesday afternoon." My father opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. His face turned a sickening shade of pale gray as he finally realized that I knew exactly how broken his version of reality truly was. Grandpa Theodore knew exactly what he was doing. I continued refusing to let him look away from my unwavering gaze. He chose the only person in this family who actually earned her place at the table. "You want me to do this for the family, but you stopped being my family the moment you watched your wife throw me out like garbage. I am keeping the company, and I am keeping my grandfather's legacy completely out of your greedy hands." I turned my back on him and walked out feeling invincible. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, biting cold that only Chicago can deliver in the early spring. I drove my practical 10-year-old sedan through the busy downtown streets, feeling a heavy mixture of profound grief and nervous anticipation. Today was the day. I was officially stepping into the Sterling Timepieces headquarters, not as the invisible granddaughter working quietly in the background, but as the rightful chief executive officer. My grandfather Theodore had entrusted me with his entire legacy, and I was determined to honor his final wishes, despite the massive target my stepmother Linda had painted on my back. I parked in the adjacent concrete garage and walked toward the towering glass and steel building. This was not just a corporate headquarters to me. It was a living, breathing monument to the thousands of hours my grandfather and I had spent examining vintage watch movements, identifying counterfeit dials, and balancing massive financial ledgers. As a forensic accountant, I had spent my entire adult life navigating complex corporate structures and exposing hidden financial truths for outside clients. But walking up to those heavy, revolving doors, I felt like a little girl again, eager to make her grandfather proud and ready to protect his life work. I clutched my leather briefcase tightly, feeling the massive weight of the responsibility resting on my shoulders. I was absolutely ready to lead, and I was ready to protect the company from Linda and her arrogant son Tyler. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the expansive marble lobby. The morning corporate rush was already well underway, with junior appraisers and sales executives hurrying across the polished floors to reach their desks. The air smelled faintly of expensive dark roast coffee and polished leather. I walked confidently toward the secure glass turnstiles, pulling my employee badge from my wool coat pocket. I had swiped this exact card thousands of times over the last 6 years, often arriving before dawn to untangle the massive tax liabilities my father and Linda had secretly created to fund their lavish lifestyle. I pressed the plastic card against the electronic sensor, fully expecting the familiar bright green light and the soft welcoming chime granting me access to the executive elevators. Instead, the scanner emitted a harsh, sharp buzz, and a bright red light flashed across the digital screen. The words, "Access denied," glowed menacingly. I frowned, completely confused by the error. I wiped the card on my sleeve, thinking it was just a simple magnetic malfunction, and pressed it against the scanner a second time. Another harsh buzz echoed in the lobby. Another bright red light flashed in my face. I looked up and saw the regular lobby security guard, a kind older man named Stan, who always greeted me with a warm smile, deliberately avoiding my eyes. He stared intensely at his computer monitor, looking deeply uncomfortable and shifting his weight nervously from side to side. A cold knot of pure, terrible dread began to form in the pit of my stomach. Something was incredibly wrong. Before I could ask Stan to manually reset my badge, the distinctive chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the cavernous lobby. The polished metal doors slid open, and my stepbrother Tyler stepped out into the main hall. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that easily cost more than my entire vehicle, looking every bit the arrogant corporate dictator he always pretended to be. But he was not walking alone. He was flanked by 3 massive men in dark suits with discreet earpieces, indicating expensive private corporate security. Tyler marched across the marble floor with a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across his face, clearly reveling in the absolute power of the moment. He stopped just on the other side of the glass turnstile, looking down his nose at me like I was a common trespasser trying to sneak into his exclusive country club. "Good morning, Jessica," he said, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "Are you having a little trouble getting to your desk today?" I stood my ground, refusing to let him see the sudden panic rising in my chest. "What exactly did you do, Tyler?" I demanded, my voice remarkably steady and ice cold. The reading of the will was explicitly clear. "I am the sole owner and chief executive of this company." Tyler let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the high marble walls, drawing the curious attention of several employees passing by. "Oh, honey," he sneered, leaning against the glass barrier. "Did you honestly think you could just waltz in here and steal my birthright because you manipulated a senile old man into changing his will? You are just a glorified bookkeeper. I am the true face of this luxury brand, and I am the one calling the shots." He gestured casually to the massive security guards, who immediately stepped forward, crossing their thick arms and forming a highly intimidating human wall between me and the executive elevators. Tyler reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive jacket and pulled out a thick legal document secured with a heavy blue backing. Without any warning, he shoved his hand right over the turnstile and aggressively slapped the thick stack of papers directly against my chest, forcing me to grab it before it fell to the floor. "Read it and weep, little sister," he spat, his eyes flashing with malicious delight. I opened the folder, letting my forensic accountant brain instantly analyze the dense legal jargon and the official red court stamps. It was a medical power of attorney and an emergency executive mandate. My blood ran completely cold as I read the dates and the authorized signatures. It had been signed by my grandfather during his final agonizing week in the hospice care facility. It was the exact same week he was heavily medicated on high doses of intravenous morphine, drifting in and out of consciousness, and barely able to recognize his own surroundings. The document granted Tyler total unrestricted emergency executive control over sterling timepieces for a mandatory period of 12 full months before the estate could even be formally processed or settled. I stared at the shaky, barely legible signature of the man I loved and felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. They had not just bypassed the official will read by the lawyer. They had actively exploited a dying man in his most vulnerable, heavily drugged moments to orchestrate a completely hostile and entirely illegal corporate takeover. "This is outright fraud, Tyler," I said, my voice vibrating with absolute righteous fury. "You forced a heavily medicated dying man to sign away his company. This garbage will never hold up in a real court of law." Tyler simply grinned wider, stepping even closer to the glass barrier. "It has the official court stamp Jessica, which means I legally own this building, this company, and every single vintage watch inside it for the next year. And my very first executive decision is terminating your employment effective immediately. You are officially trespassing on my private commercial property." He snapped his fingers loudly and pointed directly at me. "Escort this unauthorized individual off the premises, and if she tries to come back, you have my full permission to have her arrested." The 3 private security thugs moved seamlessly past the turnstiles surrounding me with calculated physical intimidation. The sheer size of them blocked out the morning light pouring in from the street. One of them placed a heavy, aggressive hand just above my elbow, firmly gripping my wool jacket. "You need to leave right now," Miss, the guard stated in a low, threatening tone meant only for my ears. I jerked my arm away, refusing to be dragged out of my grandfather's building like a common criminal. "Do not touch me," I snapped, holding my head high and refusing to let them see a single ounce of weakness. "I can walk out on my own." I turned my back on Tyler's sickeningly gloating face and marched out through the revolving glass doors, holding my leather briefcase like a shield. As soon as my boots hit the concrete pavement outside, the gray sky broke open, dumping a freezing, torrential Chicago rain over the busy city. The icy water immediately soaked through my thin coat, chilling me straight to the bone. I stood there on the wet sidewalk, shivering and entirely locked out of my own legacy, while Tyler watched me from the dry, comfortable warmth of the luxury lobby. But as the freezing rain washed over my face, the initial shock completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a burning, unshakable resolve that warmed me from the inside out. Tyler thought he had won by using a dirty legal loophole to steal a 12-month head start. But he completely forgot that I am a forensic accountant who spent 6 years doing his family's dirty taxes. He locked me out of the building, but he had absolutely no idea I was about to meticulously dismantle his entire life from the inside out. I walked into my modest apartment, dripping wet from the freezing Chicago rain. My clothes were completely soaked, clinging to my skin like ice, but I barely even noticed the physical discomfort. I dropped my leather briefcase onto the small kitchen table and peeled off my ruined wool coat. Any normal person who had just been forcefully evicted from their own family legacy by a pair of arrogant narcissists and a team of burly security guards would have probably collapsed onto the couch and cried until their lungs burned. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is what victims do when they feel powerless, and I was far from powerless. My stepbrother Tyler and my stepmother Linda thought they had completely outsmarted me with that fraudulent medical power of attorney. They genuinely believed that by throwing me out into the street, they had severed my access to sterling timepieces and secured their stolen empire. They forgot one fundamental detail about who I am. I am a forensic accountant. I do not throw tantrums. I audit. I expose the lies people bury deep in their spreadsheets. And I was about to dissect Tyler's entire life. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a massive cup of black coffee, and booted up my personal laptop. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a sharp blue glow across my face. For 6 grueling years, I had done the corporate taxes for sterling timepieces completely off the books to keep my father and Linda from sinking the company with their lavish, uncontrolled spending. My grandfather Theodore knew exactly how reckless my stepmother and her son were. He knew they viewed his magnificent vintage watch business as nothing more than a personal piggy bank. That was why 2 years ago, my grandfather quietly did something brilliant. He privately authorized the lead software engineer to create a master administrative account for the company's internal servers, and he gave the sole login credentials directly to me. It was a digital backdoor deeply embedded in the source code, giving me unrestricted, unseen access to every single ledger, inventory log, and financial transaction the company ever processed. Tyler and his overpriced IT team had absolutely no idea this backdoor even existed. To them, I was locked out. To me, their entire digital vault was sitting wide open right on my kitchen table. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, cracking my knuckles before resting my fingers over the keyboard. I typed in the complex string of characters my grandfather had assigned to me and pressed enter. The system bypassed all the standard security protocols and granted me total access in less than 3 seconds. The familiar interface of the Sterling Timepieces database loaded onto my screen. I did not waste my time looking at the standard operating accounts or the daily sales ledgers. Those were the shiny distractions companies used to look legitimate to casual observers. I bypassed the front end entirely and dove straight into the raw, unedited inventory logs. My grandfather built his fortune by restoring and appraising the rarest timepieces on the planet, pieces that collectors would wait decades to acquire. I knew the inventory like the back of my own hand. I started running aggressive data queries, filtering the logs for the highest value items over the last 18 months. I was searching for the exact moment Tyler began positioning himself for this hostile takeover. It took exactly 14 minutes for my trained eyes to spot the very first glaring anomaly. The cursor hovered over a specific entry from 8 months ago. It was a vintage 1968 Rolex Daytona, a legendary Paul Newman model with an exotic dial. In the world of high-end horology, a watch like that in its original condition was easily worth upward of $500,000. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. But according to the digital ledger, this priceless artifact had been permanently removed from the active inventory. I clicked on the status code tied to the entry. The screen displayed a short, stark note typed by Tyler himself. The note claimed the watch had been severely water damaged beyond any possible restoration, and that the internal movement was completely destroyed. The final status was marked as scrapped for parts. I stared at the screen, letting out a harsh, humorless laugh. A $500,000 vintage Daytona does not just get scrapped for parts. Even if a watch like that was run over by a freight train, you would still salvage the dial, the pushers, and the incredibly rare bezel. You do not throw a masterpiece into the trash. It was an outright impossible lie. My heart began to pound a steady rhythmic beat of pure adrenaline as I quickly expanded my search parameters. I isolated every single high-value watch that had been removed from the company vault under the guise of catastrophic damage or unsalvageable wear. The results populated on my screen, and the sheer magnitude of the theft took my breath away. It was not just one Rolex. There was a pristine Patek Philippe Grand Complication from the 1940s, marked as irreparably shattered. A vintage Audemars Piguet perpetual calendar, supposedly destroyed by a chemical spill in the cleaning room. A flawless Vacheron Constantin pocket watch, quietly written off as lost in transit during a routine appraisal transfer. Line after line, row after row, the evidence of a massive systematic robbery stared back at me. Over the course of 12 months, Tyler had methodically deleted nearly $4 million worth of irreplaceable vintage inventory. He was using his position as a senior executive to bypass my grandfather's strict oversight, waiting until the old man was too weak from his illness to physically inspect the vault. But you cannot just make $4 million worth of luxury watches vanish into thin air without leaving a money trail. I opened a separate encrypted terminal and began cross-referencing the dates of the supposed inventory losses against Tyler's known travel schedules and corporate expense reports. The pattern emerged with beautiful, devastating clarity. Every single time a major watch was marked as destroyed, Tyler took a sudden, undocumented weekend trip. He was not attending business conferences or meeting with elite clients like he constantly bragged to my father. The location data from his corporate credit card told the real story. He was taking flights to Las Vegas, Macau, and private underground clubs in Miami. Tyler had a gambling problem. A massive, uncontainable gambling addiction that had completely spiraled out of his control. He was blowing hundreds of thousands of dollars at high-stakes baccarat tables and underground poker games. When his personal trust fund and his mother's enabling handouts ran dry, he turned to the only source of liquid wealth he had left. He started bleeding my grandfather's legacy dry. I sat back in my chair, the glowing light of the screen reflecting in my eyes as I pieced together his entire sloppy criminal operation. Tyler was not just stealing these watches, he was actively fencing them. I dug into the encrypted communication logs on the server and found deleted emails that I easily recovered using my admin privileges. Tyler had been quietly communicating with a notorious black market dealer based out of Eastern Europe, a man known for purchasing stolen luxury goods at a fraction of their true auction value and disappearing them into private criminal collections. Tyler was taking my grandfather's beautifully restored masterpieces, marking them as garbage in the system, and selling them for untraceable cash to pay off his dangerous bookies. He was trading 50 years of my grandfather's blood, sweat, and tears to cover his own pathetic gambling markers. The sudden shocking realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This hostile takeover this morning was never just about Tyler wanting to sit in the big CEO chair or Linda wanting to brag to her country club friends. It was never just about ego or inheritance. It was about pure, desperate survival. Tyler knew that the moment my grandfather passed away, the estate would eventually undergo a mandatory comprehensive financial audit. If I took over the company as the rightful owner, my very first action would be doing a full inventory check of the main vault. I would instantly realize that $4 million in vintage watches were missing. Tyler would be exposed, arrested, and sent to federal prison for grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. He used the fraudulent medical power of attorney to lock me out because he desperately needed a 12-month head start. He needed a year of unchecked executive control to cook the books, falsify the remaining records, and hide the massive gaping hole he had torn into the company finances before the estate was officially settled in probate court. He threw me out into the rain this morning because he was absolutely terrified of what I would find. I took another slow sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the reality of what I was uncovering. I needed to dig deeper. I needed to make sure the evidence was entirely bulletproof before I made my next move. I opened up the banking portals, linked to the company auxiliary accounts. These were the smaller discretionary funds that my father and Tyler often used for supposed business development. The sheer audacity of their spending was sickening, but it was the corresponding deposits that caught my immediate attention. Tyler was sloppy, incredibly dangerously sloppy. He was receiving wire transfers from shell companies registered in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. The amounts were staggering. $50,000 here, $80,000 there. Always arriving just days after a priceless watch was recorded as damaged in the primary inventory logs. He was not even trying to hide the money through complex laundering channels. He was so incredibly protected by Linda's constant coddling and my father's pathetic blind eye that he genuinely believed he was invincible. I felt a sharp, painful pang in my chest as I looked at a digital photograph attached to one of the deleted files. It was an image of a vintage 1950s Omega Speedmaster, a watch my grandfather had spent 3 entire years hunting down and meticulously restoring. I remembered sitting beside him in the workshop, watching his steady, wrinkled hands place the tiny, delicate hands onto the dial. He had told me that watch belonged in a museum. Tyler had traded it for a weekend at a high-stakes roulette table. The profound disrespect for my grandfather's artistry fueled the burning fire in my veins. This was not just theft. It was the systematic desecration of a good man's legacy. I spent the next 4 hours creating a meticulous, irrefutable digital paper trail. I cross-referenced every single missing watch with the matching offshore wire transfers, and then mapped those exact dates to Tyler's casino withdrawals and private jet charters. I compiled everything into a beautifully formatted, highly detailed forensic spreadsheet. I highlighted the fraudulent entries in bright red, organizing the raw data into a narrative that any federal investigator could easily understand in 5 minutes. By the time I finished compiling the dossier, the sun had finally set over the Chicago skyline, casting long dark shadows across my apartment. My clothes had completely dried, but I still felt the icy resolve running through my entire body. Tyler had locked me out of the building. He had stood behind his wall of armed guards and called me a glorified bookkeeper. He was right about one thing. I was an accountant, and in the modern world, an accountant with a laptop and a grudge is infinitely more dangerous than any security guard. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the silent room. I had the motive, the method, and the undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. Tomorrow I was going to start the process of utterly destroying him. I sat at my small kitchen table for 3 solid hours, entirely consumed by the steady rhythm of data entry and forensic analysis. My fingers flew across the keyboard, mapping every single fraudulent entry Tyler had made to the corresponding offshore wire transfers. I compiled the offshore accounts, the dates of the missing luxury watches, and the massive cash withdrawals Tyler made in gambling hotspots. Every single row of data I color-coded in bright red felt like another brick in the solid, undeniable wall I was building around my stepbrother. I felt an incredible surge of pure, righteous vindication. I genuinely believed I was invisible. I thought that because my grandfather had secretly built that administrative backdoor for me years ago, it was completely untraceable. But my grandfather was a master watchmaker, not a modern cybersecurity expert, and I was about to learn a terrifying lesson about corporate firewalls. While I was sitting in my quiet apartment, drinking cold coffee, and building my bulletproof federal case, absolute chaos was quietly erupting on the top floor of the Sterling Timepieces headquarters. I would only find out the exact details of this frantic afternoon months later through sworn legal depositions and aggressively retrieved corporate emails, but the sequence of events was perfectly clear. Tyler had recently hired a new director of information technology, a paranoid and highly aggressive contractor named Brian, to upgrade the company servers. Tyler did not hire Brian to protect the company from outside hackers. He hired him to make sure no one inside the building could access the restricted executive files where Tyler was hiding his massive financial crimes. What neither Tyler nor my grandfather knew was that Brian had installed a heavily automated tripwire program on the main inventory database just 3 weeks earlier. The program was designed to instantly flag any massive data extraction that occurred outside of standard business hours or from an unrecognized external location. My grandfather's hidden administrative account gave me total access, but it did not hide the sheer volume of data I was pulling. When I downloaded 2 straight years of heavily restricted audit logs and inventory movement histories in a single massive batch, it tripped Brian's silent digital alarm. Tyler was sitting behind my grandfather's custom mahogany desk, physically occupying the space he had stolen just that morning. He was likely leaning back in the plush leather chair, congratulating himself on a flawless victory. He genuinely thought he had completely neutralized me by throwing me out into the freezing Chicago rain. He thought I was just a weak little girl crying in a tiny apartment. He had absolutely no idea that I possessed the skills to dismantle his entire life. Then, the private line on his desk rang. Brian did not bother with pleasantries. He told Tyler that a ghost administrative account, completely undocumented in the active employee directory, had just bypassed the primary firewall and pulled the entire raw database. Tyler immediately brushed it off, assuming it was just a routine automated backup. But Brian insisted it was a targeted manual extraction. Someone had specifically searched for the exact inventory codes tied to the vintage Patek Philippe's and the Rolex Daytonas that Tyler had secretly fenced to the black market. Brian ran a rapid trace on the connection. The internet protocol address bounced through a local commercial server, but it ultimately resolved to my exact residential apartment complex in the Chicago suburbs. I can only imagine the sheer, sickening terror that must have washed over Tyler in that exact moment. The smug, triumphant smirk he had worn in the lobby that morning would have melted right off his face. He felt the cold, hard reality of federal prison breathing directly down his neck. He knew exactly what I was looking at. He knew I was a certified forensic accountant who spent years untangling complex tax liabilities. He realized with absolute horrifying certainty that I was not just sitting at home feeling sorry for myself. I was methodically connecting his fake damaged inventory reports to the massive gaping holes in the company bank accounts. He knew I would easily trace the missing money to his offshore shell companies and his degenerate gambling debts. Tyler panicked. He slammed the phone down and immediately called his mother. Linda was allegedly at an upscale boutique downtown shopping for designer outfits to wear to her new role as the matriarch of a luxury empire when she received the frantic call. According to the later testimonies, she abandoned a rack of expensive clothes and drove her luxury SUV straight to the Sterling headquarters, breaking multiple speed limits along the way. She marched into the executive suite, locked the heavy double doors behind her, and drew the privacy blinds tightly shut. Inside that heavily soundproofed office, Tyler completely fell apart. He paced back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, pulling at his hair and hyperventilating. He confessed to Linda that I was currently downloading the exact unedited files that proved he had embezzled $4 million worth of irreplaceable vintage watches. He told her the digital trail was absolute and irrefutable. If I took that highly organized spreadsheet to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or even just handed it over to the probate judge overseeing my grandfather's estate, Tyler was looking at a minimum of 10 to 20 years behind bars for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and wire fraud. The money was completely gone. He had blown it all on high-stakes baccarat and aggressive sports betting. There was absolutely no way he could quietly replace the missing funds or miraculously return the stolen vintage masterpieces to the main vault. He was trapped. Linda, however, did not panic. Where Tyler was weak and entirely driven by impulse, Linda was cold calculating and incredibly dangerous. She forced Tyler to sit down and stop crying. She quickly analyzed the board. They could not simply fire me because I was already fired. They could not legally block my inheritance because the true will had already been read by David Vance. If I walked into a federal building the next morning with a printed copy of that damning ledger, it would be game over. The authorities would freeze the estate, arrest Tyler, and immediately strip Linda of the lavish, wealthy lifestyle she had spent 15 years manipulating my father to secure. Linda realized they had only one desperate play left. They could not erase the digital evidence I had already pulled onto my personal hard drive. The only way to save Tyler from federal prison was to completely, thoroughly, and permanently destroy my personal credibility. They needed to make sure that when I inevitably brought my forensic audit to the police, no one would believe a single word I said. Linda knew how the legal system worked. She knew that investigators and judges are incredibly skeptical of whistleblowers who have their own criminal records. If a convicted thief brings forward a wild corporate conspiracy theory about her successful, wealthy stepbrother, the police would immediately write it off as the pathetic, retaliatory lies of a disgruntled, bitter criminal. Sitting in that dimly lit office, Linda coldly formulated a plan to ruin my life. They needed to strike hard, and they needed to strike first. They needed a crime so massive and so incredibly bold that it would make local headlines and guarantee a lengthy prison sentence. They decided right then and there to frame me for grand larceny. They needed to plant something so valuable and so undeniably connected to the company that my possession of it would instantly brand me a thief. They wanted to make it look like I had grown completely unhinged after being locked out of the building that morning and decided to rob the company out of pure vindictive spite. They sat together in the quiet shadows of my grandfather's office, plotting to take away my freedom, my career, and my future simply to cover up their own disgusting greed. Linda decided she would personally handle the setup. She knew exactly where I lived, and she knew exactly how to play the role of the concerned stepmother trying to make peace. Tyler would handle the police report, ensuring the specific item was flagged as missing from the vault, with my name attached as the prime suspect. They agreed to execute the plan immediately. They had no time to waste because every passing hour gave me more time to finish compiling my audit. While I sat in my kitchen, feeling a deep, profound sense of justice finally coming to light, Idos had absolutely no idea that a massive storm was heading straight for my front door. I thought the worst thing my family could do was lock me out of a building and call me names. I did not realize they were perfectly willing to completely destroy my life and lock me in a cage just to protect their stolen wealth. I finished the last row of the spreadsheet, pressed save, and smiled at the screen. I was ready to bring them down. But Linda and Tyler were already moving their dark chess pieces into place, and they were about to bring the full, terrifying weight of the criminal justice system crashing down on my head. 3 days passed since the disastrous morning I was locked out of my own legacy. I spent those 72 hours confined to my small Chicago apartment, meticulously finalizing the digital audit that would send Tyler to federal prison. The damning evidence was completely secure, loaded onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I was simply waiting for my lawyer, David, to secure a meeting with the federal prosecutor when the heavy brass knocker on my apartment door echoed loudly through my living room. I checked the peephole, and my blood immediately ran cold. Standing in the hallway, looking incredibly out of place against the peeling wallpaper of my modest building, was my stepmother, Linda. She was wearing a beige cashmere sweater, looking completely uncharacteristically subdued. She did not have her usual arrogant posture. Instead, she looked deeply exhausted, holding a small paper bag from a local expensive bakery. I opened the door, keeping the heavy security chain firmly engaged. "What do you want, Linda?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, her eyes perfectly misting with manufactured tears. "Jessica, please," she whispered, sounding incredibly fragile. "I know you hate me. I know you hate Tyler. We handled things terribly on Monday. Your father is a complete wreck. He has not slept in days. I just want to talk. Just for 5 minutes." "I brought those lemon scones you always loved when you were a little girl." I stared at her, feeling a deep, profound sense of disgust. I knew the lemon scones trick. It was the exact same cheap manipulation tactic she used whenever she needed me to silently fix a massive accounting error or cover up one of Tyler's expensive mistakes. But I also knew I needed to maintain the absolute illusion that I was just a sad, helpless girl until David finalized the meeting with the feds. If I slammed the door in her face, it might trigger her suspicion. I slid the heavy metal chain out of its track and pulled the door open, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped inside, her expensive perfume immediately filling the cramped space of my small living room. "I will make some tea," I said, turning my back on her for less than 30 seconds to walk into the tiny adjacent kitchen. That was my massive critical mistake. You never, ever turn your back on a predator. I filled the kettle, listening to the soft rustle of her cashmere sweater as she hovered near the front entryway. I assumed she was just removing her heavy wool coat. I had absolutely no idea she was reaching into her deep designer handbag, pulling out a small, heavy velvet box, and quietly sliding it deep into the pocket of my own winter coat, hanging securely in the hallway closet. I brought the tea out and set it on the small coffee table. We sat in uncomfortable, agonizing silence for 10 excruciating minutes. Linda played her role perfectly. She apologized profusely for Tyler's aggressive behavior, claiming he was just overwhelmed by grief and the heavy pressure of the business. She begged me to consider a private family settlement, avoiding any messy public legal battles. I nodded silently, sipping my tea, giving her absolutely nothing to work with. When she finally realized I was not going to break down and surrender, she stood up, smoothing her expensive skirt with trembling hands. "Think about it, Jessica," she said, her voice carrying a sharp, desperate edge. "We are the only family you have left." She walked out the door, and I locked the deadbolt immediately behind her, breathing a heavy sigh of relief. I thought I had successfully navigated her pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation. I had absolutely no idea she had just planted a ticking time bomb directly inside my home. 3 hours later, the quiet peace of my evening was violently shattered. I was sitting on my couch wearing my worn-out flannel pajamas, reviewing the final pages of the forensic audit when a loud, incredibly aggressive pounding rattled my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, terrifying strike of law enforcement. "Chicago Police Department, open the door immediately," a deep, booming voice commanded. My heart slammed against my ribs. I scrambled off the couch, my bare feet slipping on the hardwood floor, and reached for the doorknob. Before my fingers could even touch the metal, the door was forcefully kicked open, the heavy wood slamming violently against the hallway wall. 3 large police officers, in full tactical gear, rushed into my small living room, their hands resting securely on their heavy-duty belts. Jessica Sterling, the lead officer, barked, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "We have a signed warrant to search these premises. Step away from the computer right now." I raised my hands, stepping backward, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying invasion. What is going on? I stammered, my voice trembling wildly. You have no right to be here. The lead officer pulled a folded piece of paper from his tactical vest and shoved it directly into my face. We have every right, ma'am. The owner of Sterling Timepieces reported a massive theft from their secure downtown vault. A vintage Vacheron Constantine valued at roughly $2.5 million. He specifically named you as the primary suspect, claiming you made aggressive threats against the company after being legally terminated earlier this week. My stomach plummeted, completely dropping out of my body. Tyler, he had actually done it. He knew I was actively digging into his massive financial crimes, so he aggressively struck first, using his fraudulent executive status to frame me for grand larceny. He wanted to entirely destroy my credibility before I could hand my bulletproof audit over to the federal authorities. He wanted me locked in a cage so no one would ever believe a single word I said. This is an absolute lie, I yelled desperately, trying to maintain control as two officers began aggressively tearing through my small apartment. I am the legal owner of that company. My stepbrother is framing me to cover up his own massive embezzlement. You need to call my attorney, David Vance. He can prove everything. The lead officer ignored my frantic pleas completely, focusing his attention on his radio. He gestured sharply to his partner, pointing directly toward the small entryway closet near the front door. Check the coats, he commanded. I watched in absolute suffocating horror as the second officer yanked open the closet door. He aggressively patted down the heavy winter coats hanging on the rack. When his thick hand reached my dark wool trench coat, he stopped. He reached deeply into the right pocket and slowly pulled out a small, dark blue velvet box. The exact same distinct box my grandfather used to store his most prized elite restorations. The officer slowly flipped the velvet lid open. Resting perfectly against the pristine white satin was a stunning, incredibly rare vintage Vacheron Constantine. The polished gold case and the intricate dial gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of my hallway. The entire room went dead silent. The lead officer turned to me, his expression hardening into pure cold disgust. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, he ordered, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. You are under arrest for grand larceny. No, you do not understand, I screamed, the sheer terror finally breaking through my forensic composure. My stepmother was just here 3 hours ago. She planted that box in my coat. You have to believe me. This is a massive setup. They are trying to silence me. Save it for the judge, the officer grunted, roughly, grabbing my wrists and twisting my arms sharply behind my back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked tightly around my wrists, biting painfully into my skin. He grabbed my upper arm and aggressively marched me out of my apartment and into the brightly lit public hallway. My neighbors were standing in their open doorways, watching the entire terrifying spectacle unfold. Mrs. Higgins, the sweet elderly woman from across the hall, covered her mouth in absolute shock. Mr. Davies, the quiet retired teacher from down the hall, stared at me with heavy, condemning judgment. I was being paraded through my own building, wearing cheap flannel pajamas, completely humiliated and branded a common multi-million-dollar thief in front of everyone I knew. The harsh glare of the police flashlights completely blinded me as they shoved me forcefully into the back of a waiting squad car. The heavy metal door slammed shut, trapping me in the cold, dark interior. Tyler and Linda had successfully executed their ruthless trap. They had completely stripped me of my freedom, my dignity, and my professional credibility. As the squad car pulled away from my apartment building, diving deep into the freezing, rainy Chicago night, I realized they had effectively silenced the only person who knew their dark criminal secrets. I was heading straight to a county jail cell, completely isolated and facing 15 years in federal prison, while the people who destroyed my legacy sat comfortably in their stolen mansion. The concrete walls of the holding cell were painted a sickly shade of industrial green that seemed to actively absorb the dim, flickering light from the single fluorescent bulb overhead. I sat completely still on the freezing metal bench, pulling the scratchy fabric of my county-issued jumpsuit tightly around my shoulders. The heavy steel door separating me from the rest of the world felt like the physical manifestation of my entire nightmare. For the last 24 hours, I had been stripped of my clothes, my dignity, and my basic human rights. I had been processed, fingerprinted, and shoved into a cage with the absolute certainty that I was facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit: grand larceny. The words echoed in my head with a sickening rhythm. Tyler and Linda had not just framed me, they had orchestrated a masterclass in absolute betrayal. They had chosen the vintage Vacheron Constantine intentionally. It was the undisputed crown jewel of my grandfather's private collection, a $2.5 million masterpiece of horology that he had spent over a decade meticulously restoring. I knew every gear, every polished bridge, and every single scratch on that beautiful gold case. The fact that Linda had casually slipped that sacred artifact into my coat closet like a cheap piece of contraband made my blood boil with a rage so hot it threatened to consume me. But I could not afford to be consumed by anger right now. My forensic accountant brain, the exact same brain that had spent 6 years quietly keeping sterling timepieces from collapsing under my family's greedy negligence, was working in extreme overdrive. I sat on that freezing bench, calculating every single variable of my current, terrifying reality. I knew exactly why they had done this. They knew I had accessed the digital backdoor to the inventory servers. They knew I had compiled the devastating audit that linked Tyler's fake damaged inventory reports directly to his offshore shell companies and his massive unpayable gambling debts. They were terrified. They had kicked my front door down with the Chicago Police Department because it was the only possible way to completely destroy my credibility before I could hand that bulletproof evidence over to the federal authorities. If a convicted thief brings a wild corporate conspiracy to a judge, it is instantly dismissed as pathetic retaliation. They needed me locked away and silenced permanently. The heavy metal lock on my cell door suddenly clicked, echoing loudly in the damp, cavernous space. A female corrections officer pushed the door open, her face completely devoid of any emotion. "You have visitors," she stated bluntly, holding out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." I stood up, my legs feeling stiff and bruised from the uncomfortable metal bench. I turned around and allowed the cold, heavy steel to lock tightly around my wrists. Every single step I took down the long, sterile concrete corridor felt like walking directly to my own execution. The chains clinked softly against my waist, a constant, humiliating reminder of my stolen freedom. I prayed silently that my attorney, David Vance, was sitting on the other side of the glass, ready to post my bail and get me back to my laptop. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I already knew exactly who was waiting for me. The visitation room was a narrow, brightly lit space, divided evenly by a thick wall of smudged bulletproof plexiglass. The officer guided me to a bolted metal stool and forced me to sit down. Through the scratched clear barrier, I saw them. Linda and Tyler were sitting completely relaxed on the visitor side, looking like they had just stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine spread. Linda was wearing an immaculate camel-colored cashmere coat, her hair perfectly blown out, and her makeup flawlessly applied. She looked absolutely radiant, radiating the sickeningly satisfied glow of a woman who had finally exterminated her biggest problem. Tyler sat next to her, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. He had a smug, arrogant smirk plastered firmly across his face, leaning back in his plastic chair, with his legs casually crossed. They looked entirely out of place in the grim, depressing reality of a county jail. The sheer visual contrast between their expensive luxury and my scratchy orange prison uniform was designed to make me feel small, powerless, and utterly defeated. Linda leaned forward, pressing her manicured fingers delicately against the thick plexiglass. She picked up the black plastic telephone receiver mounted on the wall and gestured for me to do the same. I lifted my bound hands, awkwardly managing to grasp the receiver and press it to my ear. "Hello, Jessica," Linda said, her voice dripping with artificial sticky sweetness. "It completely broke my heart to see you in such a terrible, terrible place. You look absolutely awful, honey. It must be so frightening in there all by yourself." I stared at her, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. My face remained a perfectly blank stone mask. I did not speak. I just let her voice hang in the stale air, knowing that she was absolutely desperate to control the narrative. Tyler leaned into the microphone, his arrogant smirk widening into a full malicious grin. "You really messed up this time, little sister," he sneered. "I told the police exactly how unstable you have been acting since grandfather passed away. I told them how you threatened the company and how you felt entitled to things that did not belong to you. When they found the Vacheron Constantine hidden in your coat pocket, well, the detective told me they have an airtight case. Grand larceny of a $2.5 million asset carries a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal facility. You are going to be locked in a cage until you are well into your 40s. He was enjoying this far too much. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. But beneath his arrogant gloating, I could see the tiny, unmistakable cracks of sheer panic around his eyes. He was talking too fast. He was overcompensating. He needed this victory lap because he was still absolutely terrified of the audit sitting on my hard drive. Linda gently pushed Tyler back and took total control of the conversation. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a crisp white legal document. She slid it smoothly through the narrow metal transfer slot at the bottom of the plexiglass partition. The heavy paper pushed through the gap, resting on the metal counter directly in front of my handcuffed wrists. I looked down at the bold black lettering at the top of the page. It was a complete, unconditional transfer of equity. It was the formal legal surrender of my entire 100% ownership stake in sterling timepieces, handing absolute permanent control directly over to Tyler. "Sign the company over to Tyler right now," Linda said, her voice dropping its fake sweetness and turning into a sharp, commanding blade. "Sign the document today, and Tyler will personally call the district attorney this afternoon. We will tell the police it was all just a terrible family misunderstanding. We will say you had permission to take the watch for an independent appraisal and the communication simply got crossed. The charges will be dropped immediately and you can walk out of this disgusting place a completely free woman. You can go back to your quiet little life and we will never bother you again." She leaned closer, her perfectly lined eyes locking onto mine with ruthless, predatory intensity. "But if you refuse to sign that paper, Jessica, we will push the prosecution to the absolute maximum limit. We will bury you in court. You will lose everything you have ever worked for, and you will rot in federal prison for the best years of your life. The choice is entirely yours." I stared down at the transfer document, my mind racing through thousands of complex calculations per second. This was the moment of absolute truth. I suddenly realized exactly why they were here. The medical power of attorney Tyler had shoved in my face on Monday morning was only a temporary emergency measure. It gave him operational control for 12 months, but it did not give him permanent equity. It did not give him the legal right to liquidate the company assets or permanently shield his offshore gambling crimes from a future estate audit. He needed my actual legal surrender. He needed me to voluntarily hand over the crown to make his hostile takeover completely bulletproof. They were incredibly desperate. They were holding my freedom hostage because it was the only leverage they had left. I knew that if I flatly refused to sign the document, they would leave me in this cell to rot. They would let the massive gears of the criminal justice system slowly grind me down while Tyler systematically destroyed whatever was left of my grandfather's company. I could not stay in this cage. I needed to get out. I needed to get to David Vance, and I needed to expose my audit to the world. But I also knew I could never give them a valid legal signature. I needed to buy time. I needed to manipulate the manipulators. I needed to give them exactly the performance they had come here to see. I closed my eyes and let my shoulders physically collapse. I thought about the horrible freezing rain. I thought about the sheer humiliation of being arrested in my pajamas. I tapped into every single ounce of real trauma and exhaustion I was feeling and pushed it directly to the surface. When I opened my eyes, my vision was completely blurred with genuine tears. I let a ragged, pathetic sob tear through my throat. I forced my hands to shake violently, causing the heavy steel handcuffs to rattle loudly against the metal counter. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking into a high-pitched, terrified whisper. Please, Linda, I cannot stay in here. It is so cold. The guards are awful. I am so scared. Please do not let them send me to prison. I will do whatever you want. I will give you the company. Just please get me out of here. Linda's eyes lit up with absolute euphoric triumph. She sat back in her chair looking at me like a queen surveying a conquered peasant. I knew you would finally see reason. She purred, her voice dripping with immense satisfaction. You are making the smart choice, Jessica. Pick up the pen and sign the paper. We can have you out by dinner. I picked up the cheap plastic pen they provided, grasping it with trembling fingers. I hovered the tip over the signature line, letting another heavy tear fall directly onto the paper. Then I stopped. I slowly lowered the pen and looked up at Tyler, completely channeling the persona of a broken, defeated girl trying to salvage one tiny shred of dignity. I will sign it, Tyler, I whimpered, sniffing loudly. I will give you everything. But you cannot do it like this. You cannot take my signature in a dirty jail cell. Tyler frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly. What the hell does it matter where you sign it? Just put your name on the line. I shook my head violently, rattling the chains again. It matters because it is a legal liability, I sobbed, wiping my face with my shoulder. Tyler, I am an accountant. I know how corporate law works. If I sign a complete transfer of equity while sitting in a county jail cell wearing handcuffs, any decent probate judge will instantly flag it as signed under extreme duress. It is the textbook definition of coercion. The courts will freeze the transfer the moment the estate goes to probate. You will not have clean ownership. The board of directors will question the legitimacy of the transfer, and investors will panic. You want this to be absolutely permanent, do you not? You want no one to ever question your authority. I watched the wheels turning rapidly behind Tyler's eyes. I was playing directly to his massive, unchecked ego and his deep-seated paranoia about being caught. I knew he desperately wanted the transfer to be ironclad to protect his stolen millions. I knew he wanted to be seen as the legitimate, undisputed king of sterling timepieces. You need to do this the right way. I continued, my voice trembling perfectly. You are the visionary CEO, Tyler. You need to take the company from me in the daylight. If I sign this right now, it looks like a cheap extortion scheme. Let me out of here today. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you assemble the entire executive board of directors in the main conference room. I will walk in there and officially sign the transfer of equity in front of all the senior partners. I will publicly state that I am stepping down voluntarily because I cannot handle the pressure of the role. It will be officially witnessed, legally binding, and absolutely impossible for anyone to contest. You get the company completely clean, and you get to show the board that you are the one in total control. Tyler stared at me, completely captivated by the intoxicating vision I had just painted for him. He imagined himself sitting at the head of the massive glass boardroom table, watching me publicly surrender my grandfather's legacy in front of the entire executive staff. It was the ultimate display of dominance, and his narcissistic brain absolutely craved it. Linda leaned in, her eyes narrowing with sharp suspicion. Tyler, do not listen to her, she hissed urgently. She is just stalling. Make her sign the paper right now. No. Tyler snapped sharply, holding up his hand to silence his mother. He looked at me, his chest puffing out with absolute arrogant superiority. She's actually right, Mother. If a judge sees a jailhouse signature on a multi-million-dollar transfer, they will tie me up in litigation for years. I am not taking any stupid legal risks with my company. I want her to hand it over in front of the board. I want those old executives to see her publicly fold. Tyler leaned close to the plexiglass, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. You listen to me very carefully, Jesse. I am going to make a call and get the charges temporarily suspended so you can make bail. You will go home. You will put on a nice suit, and you will be at the headquarters tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. You will sign the company over to me in front of the board with a smile on your face. If you try to run, or if you try to pull any stupid tricks, I will reinstate the felony grand larceny charges before you even reach the lobby, and you will spend the rest of your pathetic life in a cage. Do you understand me? I nodded meekly, keeping my head bowed in total submission. I understand, Tyler. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to do this right. Tyler stood up, buttoning his expensive jacket with a smug, victorious grin. "Come on, Mother," he said, turning away from the glass. "We have a board meeting to organize. Let the bookkeeper go home and prepare her resignation speech." Linda glared at me one final time. Her eyes filled with cold, lingering doubt before she finally stood up and followed her son out of the visitation room. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind them, leaving me completely alone in the quiet space. The absolute second they were out of sight, the tears immediately stopped. The pathetic trembling in my hands completely vanished. I sat up perfectly straight on the metal stool, my spine rigid and my mind razor sharp. I had given them the performance of a lifetime, and they had swallowed the bait whole. They thought they had broken my spirit and secured their stolen empire. They had absolutely no idea that I had just orchestrated the exact public stage I needed. I was not going to the board meeting to surrender. I was going to the board meeting to publicly execute my stepbrother and burn his entire fraudulent life straight to the ground. The heavy steel doors of the Cook County Jail slid open with a deafening metallic clink that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, pulling my damp, ruined wool coat tightly around my shoulders. The stale, suffocating smell of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies instantly vanished completely, replaced by the sharp, biting scent of wet asphalt and freezing rain. I stood on the concrete steps, taking my very first breath of actual freedom in 24 hours. Standing right at the bottom of the concrete steps, waiting patiently under the harsh glare of a flickering orange street lamp, was David Vance. My grandfather's fiercely loyal attorney had not abandoned me. He had rushed down to the courthouse, completely navigating the bureaucratic nightmare of the criminal justice system to post my exorbitant bail. He looked exhausted, his signature charcoal suit slightly wrinkled, but his eyes held that same unshakable professional steel. He handed me my confiscated belongings in a clear plastic bag. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply nodded and told me we had a massive amount of work to do before the sun came up. I grabbed the bag feeling a profound sense of gratitude, mixed with an absolute burning desire for vengeance. Tyler and Linda had orchestrated my public humiliation, dragging me out of my apartment in handcuffs to completely destroy my credibility. But stepping out into that freezing parking lot, my forensic accountant brain was already calculating my massive counterstrike. We walked across the slick, dark pavement toward David's parked sedan. The wind whipped across the empty lot, biting at my face, but the cold was absolutely nothing compared to the ice running through my veins. Before we could even reach the car, a sleek, heavily tinted black SUV suddenly pulled directly into our path. The vehicle aggressively blocked our exit, its bright halogen headlights cutting blindly through the darkness. David immediately stepped in front of me, holding his arm out in a protective stance, fully anticipating another one of Linda's pathetic ambushes. The heavy engine idled smoothly, and the tinted passenger window slowly rolled down. I braced myself for another screaming match, but the face that emerged from the shadows completely stopped me in my tracks. It was Jasmine, Tyler's wife. She put the SUV in park and stepped out into the freezing night air. Jasmine was a fiercely intelligent African-American woman who commanded absolute respect in every single room she entered. She was entirely self-made. She had clawed her way up from nothing to build one of the most successful luxury real estate brokerages in the entire Chicago metropolitan area. She did not inherit a single dime. She earned her empire through sheer ruthless grit and an unparalleled work ethic. Even now, standing in a miserable jail parking lot at 3 a.m, she looked absolutely flawless in a sharply tailored camel coat and pristine leather boots. But there was no warmth in her stunning face. Her expression was a terrifying mask of pure, icy fury. Her dark eyes locked directly onto mine, carrying a lethal intensity that actually made me take a step backward. She was not here to play family politics. She was here for blood. Jasmine did not say hello. She did not offer a single word of empty sympathy regarding my horrific night in a holding cell. She simply marched right up to me, reached into her deep coat pocket, and pulled out a small, heavy, silver object. With a swift, aggressive motion, she tossed it directly at my chest. I scrambled to catch it, my frozen fingers barely grasping the cold metal. I looked down at my palm. It was a high-capacity encrypted USB drive. I looked back up at her, completely stunned by the sudden, bizarre exchange. "My husband is an absolute reckless idiot," Jasmine said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that cut perfectly through the howling wind. He actually thought he could hide his pathetic little financial schemes from a woman who audits multi-million-dollar property portfolios before breakfast. "I've known something was terribly wrong for months, Jessica." Tyler thought he was being so incredibly clever, but he is fundamentally lazy, and lazy men always leave a massive sloppy trail. I stood there clutching the small metal drive, listening intently as Jasmine laid out the entire timeline. She explained that she had noticed massive glaring discrepancies in their joint checking accounts over the past year. Massive wire transfers mysteriously disappearing into random overseas holding companies. Huge chunks of cash suddenly vanishing without a single logical explanation. Whenever she confronted Tyler, he would defensively gaslight her, claiming they were simply high-yield private investments authorized by my grandfather. But Jasmine knew how to spot a bad investment, and she knew how to spot a desperate liar. She quietly started digging into his private life, completely bypassing his childish password protections. She checked his browser history, his hidden text messages, and his deleted emails. She realized very quickly that her husband was not a brilliant investor. He was a degenerate gambling addict drowning in millions of dollars of black market debt. But that is not what is on that drive. Jasmine continued gesturing sharply toward the USB in my hand. He has been acting incredibly paranoid all week, constantly checking his phone and whispering in corners with your snake of a stepmother. Yesterday morning, after he proudly announced that you had been arrested for stealing the vintage Vacheron Constantin, knew exactly what I had to do. Tyler is so blinded by his own massive ego that he completely forgot I have full administrative access to the security system on his Tesla. I pulled the entire dashcam history for the last 72 hours. My breath caught in my throat as the sheer magnitude of her words washed over me. Jasmine stepped closer, the harsh street lamp illuminating the absolute disgust etched across her face. "That drive contains 4 hours of crystal clear, high-definition footage," Jasmine said, her voice vibrating with intense, concentrated rage. "It shows Tyler driving to a filthy, abandoned industrial park on the south side of the city 2 nights ago. It shows him getting out of his expensive car and walking directly up to a man known by the local authorities for dealing in incredibly high-end counterfeit goods. The camera perfectly captures Tyler, pulling a massive stack of cash out of his briefcase and handing it over to this criminal. In exchange, the man hands Tyler a small, dark blue velvet box. The exact same velvet box the police supposedly found in your coat closet. The camera zooms in perfectly when Tyler opens it in the front seat of his car. It is a flawless, incredibly detailed replica of your grandfather's $2.5 million Vacheron Constantin. The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The police found the watch that had me facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary was a complete fake. Tyler had already taken the real priceless masterpiece from the vault and sold it to his European black market connections to cover his massive gambling debts. When Linda realized I was auditing the servers, they needed to frame me instantly. Since the real watch was already gone, Tyler rushed out and bought a high-quality fake, paying a criminal to perfectly replicate the dial and the serial numbers. Linda then planted that fake watch in my apartment, knowing the police would not immediately verify its authenticity during a chaotic late-night raid. They set me up with a cheap replica, assuming I would be locked away long before anyone bothered to have a master watchmaker actually open the case and inspect the internal movement. He bought a fake watch to destroy your life because he was terrified you were going to expose his massive embezzlement. Jasmine stated, her eyes practically burning holes through the freezing night air. He brought the police into this. He brought the federal authorities into my orbit. He actually thought I would just stand by and play the supportive little wife while he dragged my pristine name through the mud to cover his own pathetic incompetence. I looked at Jasmine, feeling an overwhelming wave of profound respect for this incredible woman. She owed me absolutely nothing. We had never been close entirely because Tyler and Linda constantly forced a toxic wedge between everyone in the family. But in this critical, defining moment, Jasmine was handing me the ultimate weapon to completely obliterate my stepbrother. The dashcam footage on that USB drive was the holy grail of forensic evidence. It proved premeditated fraud evidence, tampering, filing a false police report, and grand larceny all in one single, unarguable video file. Combined with my server audit, this drive was a guaranteed one-way ticket to federal prison for both Tyler and Linda. "Jasmine, why are you giving this to me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. "You know exactly what I'm going to do with it. You know this means Tyler goes to prison for a very long time. You will be dragged into the massive media fallout. Your marriage will be entirely over." Jasmine did not even blink. She pulled her camel coat tighter around her waist, standing perfectly straight and radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable power. "I built my real estate firm from nothing," she said, her voice ringing with fierce, undeniable pride. "I worked 80-hour weeks for 10 years. I fought through every single barrier, every ounce of prejudice, and every closed door in this city to build a reputation that is completely bulletproof. I am a self-made woman, Jessica. My name means integrity. My name means success. I will not let my husband's pathetic fraud destroy my reputation. Burn him." She took one final step back toward her heavy black SUV, turning her face away from the biting wind. She opened the driver's side door, but paused, looking back at me over her shoulder. Her dark eyes held a terrifying, brilliant clarity. "You take that drive to the board meeting tomorrow morning," she commanded with absolute ruthless finality. "You take your audit, and you take his dashcam footage. Do not show them any mercy because they would have gladly let you rot in a concrete cage for the rest of your life. Burn his entire fraudulent world straight to the ground." Jasmine slid into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut. The massive engine roared to life, and the black SUV quickly pulled out of the dreary jail parking lot, disappearing into the freezing Chicago rain. I stood there on the wet pavement, my fingers tightly gripping the small metal USB drive. David walked up beside me, staring quietly into the darkness where Jasmine's car had vanished. He looked down at the drive in my hand, and then up at my face. I did not feel like a scared victim anymore. I felt like an executioner. The frame job was completely broken. Tyler thought he was a visionary playing a grand game of corporate chess, but he had tragically underestimated the two smartest women in his life. I looked at David slipping the drive safely into my pocket and gave him a sharp, determined nod. We had a board meeting to prepare for, and I had a corrupt empire to completely burn to the ground. David and I sat in his secure downtown office while the city of Chicago slowly woke up outside the tall glass windows. We plugged the encrypted USB drive Jasmine had given me into a secure offline computer, and the screen immediately flickered to life. My heart hammered a heavy, relentless rhythm against my ribs as I watched the crisp, high-definition footage from the dashboard camera of Tyler's car. I watched my arrogant stepbrother pull into a desolate, crumbling industrial park on the south side of the city. I watched him step out into the freezing rain with a heavy leather briefcase clutched in his greedy hands. The illegal transaction unfolded on the screen with absolutely sickening clarity. Tyler handed over thick stacks of stolen cash to a known criminal replica dealer and received a small dark blue velvet box in return. He got back into the driver's seat and popped the lid open under the interior cabin lights. The camera perfectly captured his smug, relieved smile as he inspected the counterfeit Vacheron Constantin. He had meticulously orchestrated my entire downfall to save his own pathetic skin. He bought a fake masterpiece to frame me for grand larceny, ensuring I would rot in a federal prison while he liquidated my grandfather's actual legacy. A suffocating wave of intense anger washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by something else entirely. A memory sharp and incredibly sudden pierced through the heavy fog of my exhaustion. I closed my eyes, and I was instantly transported back to the sterile smelling room of the hospice care facility. It was just 3 days before my grandfather passed away. The room was terribly quiet except for the rhythmic hissing of his oxygen machine. I was sitting exactly where I always sat, right beside his bed, holding his frail, paper-thin hand in mine. He was heavily medicated, drifting in and out of a morphine-induced sleep. My father and Linda had not visited him in days, and Tyler was supposedly away on another urgent business trip. It was just the two of us sitting in the quiet twilight. Suddenly, my grandfather had squeezed my fingers with a shocking amount of strength for a dying man. His eyes fluttered open, clear and desperate and entirely focused. He pulled me close until I could feel his shallow breath against my cheek. He did not say he loved me or offer a generic comforting goodbye. Instead, he whispered a frantic cryptic command directly into my ear. "Check the movement of the 1968 Daytona," he had gasped. Check the movement, Jesse. At the time, I genuinely thought it was just the heavy narcotics scrambling his brilliant mind. I gently stroked his silver hair and told him I would take care of everything, assuming he was simply hallucinating about his favorite vintage pieces. But staring at the frozen frame of Tyler's counterfeit watch on David's computer screen, the true magnificent meaning of those final words hit me with the force of an absolute earthquake. My grandfather was not hallucinating. He was leaving me a desperate hidden map. In the complex world of high horology, the movement is the mechanical heart of the watch. It is the intricate engine that makes the piece function. And the 1968 Rolex Daytona was not just any random watch in the vault. It was the very first timepiece my grandfather and I had ever completely disassembled and restored together when I was just 15 years old. He had made me memorize every single serial number and every engraved digit on that internal caliber to teach me the vital importance of absolute precision. I knew that specific string of numbers better than my own social security number. I shot up from the leather guest chair, my forensic accounting brain firing on all cylinders. David looked at me completely startled by my sudden, rapid movement. "I know where the real watch is," I said, my voice trembling with a potent mixture of awe and pure adrenaline. I know exactly what he was trying to tell me. My grandfather did not just leave me the company. He left me a massive failsafe. The Daytona movement is a serial number, and that serial number is a passcode. David frowned deeply, completely confused, asking what exactly a watch serial number was supposed to unlock. I looked him dead in the eyes, the pieces of the massive puzzle finally snapping into perfect, flawless alignment. Before my grandfather moved into the hospice facility, he quietly told me he had secured a private safety deposit box at the premier corporate branch of First Chicago Trust. He said it was strictly for extreme emergencies, but he never gave me the physical key or the digital combination. He knew Tyler and Linda were hovering around like hungry vultures, waiting for him to die, so they could tear his valuable assets apart. He hid the most important things he owned, and he gave me the combination with his dying breath. We did not waste a single second. David grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and we rushed down to the underground parking garage. The early morning traffic was surprisingly light as David aggressively drove his sedan through the slick, rain-soaked streets of the financial district. The sky was a bruised purple, slowly turning into a dull slate gray as the sun finally began to rise over Lake Michigan. We pulled up to the towering stone facade of First Chicago Trust precisely at 8 o'clock, just as the heavy brass doors were being unlocked for private elite corporate clients. As the named executor of the estate, David had the absolute legal authority to request access to the secure vault, but I was the only person on Earth who possessed the numerical key to actually open the specific box. We walked into the grand, incredibly quiet lobby, our footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floors. A stern-looking bank manager in a tailored suit checked our legal credentials and silently escorted us down a long carpeted hallway to the reinforced steel elevator that led directly into the subterranean vault. The air down there was noticeably cooler, climate-controlled, and smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. The manager led us through a massive circular steel door that looked like it belonged on a military submarine and into a long, narrow corridor lined entirely with polished metal boxes. He stopped in front of a large, secure drawer near the very end of the row and stepped back, giving us complete, absolute privacy. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I approached the cold metal surface. There was a highly sophisticated digital keypad integrated directly into the thick steel door. I took a deep, shaky breath, squeezing my eyes shut to perfectly recall the vivid memory of that vintage Rolex Daytona. I pictured the tiny, delicate, engraved numbers on the metallic bridge of the movement. I opened my eyes and slowly typed the long sequence of digits onto the glowing keypad. The small digital screen blinked rapidly, processing the complex code. A second later, a loud mechanical click echoed through the silent vault, followed by the soft hum of the internal locking mechanism disengaging. A bright green light illuminated on the security panel. The code was absolutely perfect. I gripped the heavy steel handle and pulled the long drawer completely out of the wall, carrying it over to the private viewing table in the center of the secure room. David stood silently beside me, respectfully keeping his distance as I lifted the heavy metal lid. The very first thing I saw resting perfectly in the center of the dark space was a beautiful antique wooden box. It was not the cheap modern velvet Tyler had bought from a street criminal. This was genuine aged mahogany, polished to a rich, brilliant shine. I reached out with trembling fingers and slowly lifted the brass latch. Resting inside, safely nestled against incredibly soft aged silk, was the authentic crown jewel of the Sterling collection, the real vintage Vacheron Constantin. The $2.5 million masterpiece was absolutely breathtaking, its solid gold case gleaming flawlessly under the bright, harsh vault lights. Tyler had never sold it to the black market because my grandfather had quietly removed it from the main inventory and locked it away securely, knowing his greedy grandson would eventually try to steal it. But the magnificent watch was not the most important thing inside that metal drawer. Resting directly underneath the mahogany box was a thick, weather-beaten black leather notebook. It was my grandfather's personal private ledger. I carefully lifted the heavy book, feeling the worn, familiar texture of the leather against my palms. I slowly opened the cover and began turning the delicate pages. My eyes instantly filled with thick, hot tears as I recognized his meticulous, tiny, handwritten script. This was not a simple diary of his daily thoughts. This was a completely comprehensive, fully documented federal indictment written by a master watchmaker who knew he was rapidly running out of time. The pages contained exact dates, time-specific inventory serial numbers, and massive glaring financial discrepancies. My grandfather had known everything. For long, agonizing months, while his physical health rapidly deteriorated, his brilliant analytical mind remained incredibly sharp. He had been quietly monitoring the digital inventory servers, matching Tyler's erratic movements to the missing high-value watches. He had literally documented every single time Tyler marked a priceless vintage Rolex or a rare Patek Philippe as damaged beyond repair. He had tracked the corresponding dates when Tyler would suddenly charter private offshore flights to Las Vegas and Macau. My grandfather had literally built a completely bulletproof federal criminal case, tracking every single stolen cent and every single fabricated inventory report. He knew Tyler was systematically embezzling millions of dollars to feed a horrific gambling addiction. He knew Linda was actively covering up the massive gaping holes in the company finances to protect her precious son and preserve her own lavish lifestyle. A massive, heavy sob finally tore through my throat, echoing loudly in the quiet, sterile vault. "He knew David," I whispered, clutching the heavy leather notebook tightly to my chest. He knew absolutely everything they were doing behind his back. He knew they were intentionally destroying his life work, but he was too physically weak to stop them. He was trapped in a failing, dying body, watching them tear apart everything he had built with his own two hands. So he gathered all the irrefutable evidence, locked it away in the dark, and patiently waited for me to find it. He left this hidden ledger for me to execute, because he knew I was the only person in the entire family who would actually have the courage to pull the trigger. David gently placed his hand on my shoulder, looking down at the detailed handwritten pages with absolute profound respect. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," Jessica David said, his voice incredibly soft and filled with deep sorrow. He knew Tyler would try to manipulate the board and steal the company. He knew Linda would try to completely ruin you. He set an intricate, beautiful trap, and he trusted you to be the one to finally spring it. He armed you with the exact weapons you need to permanently end this nightmare. I wiped the tears roughly from my face, feeling a massive surge of absolute unstoppable power replacing my grief. The puzzle was completely solved. Tyler and Linda thought they were playing a grand game of corporate chess, but they were actually just walking blindly through a fatal minefield my grandfather had laid out months ago. They tried to frame me for grand larceny to permanently silence my audit, but they had completely failed. I now possessed the real Vacheron Constantine, proving the police report was a complete malicious fabrication. I had the dashcam footage proving Tyler bought a fake watch to plant in my apartment. And most importantly, I had the black leather ledger proving Tyler had embezzled millions of dollars, leaving a massive sloppy criminal trail that the federal authorities would absolutely devour. I closed the heavy black notebook and placed it securely into my leather briefcase, right alongside the real vintage watch and the encrypted USB drive Jasmine had given me. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel of the massive vault doors. The scared invisible girl who used to hide in the shadows of the family estate was completely gone. I was the true chief executive officer of Sterling Timepieces. I was the rightful protector of my grandfather's legacy, and I was about to walk into a corporate boardroom and absolutely destroy the people who tried to ruin my life. David and I left the subterranean bank vault and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago morning. But I did not feel the bitter cold anymore. I clutched my heavy leather briefcase tightly to my chest, feeling the solid, incredibly heavy weight of my grandfather's hidden legacy resting safely against my ribs. Inside that dark leather bag, I held the authentic $2.5 million vintage Vacheron Constantine, watched the encrypted silver USB drive containing Jasmine's damning dashcam footage, and the incredibly detailed weathered black leather ledger my grandfather had meticulously kept to document every single stolen cent. It was no longer just a collection of physical evidence. It was an absolute weaponized arsenal of truth. Tyler and Linda had spent 15 agonizing years treating me like a pathetic, annoying burden, forcing me into the dark shadows while they shamelessly and systematically bled our family legacy dry. They actually thought they could kick my front door down, have me forcefully arrested in my pajamas, and scare me into blindly surrendering my rightful birthright. But they had absolutely no idea what kind of resilient woman my grandfather had actually raised. I was a trained forensic accountant, and they had just handed me every single missing piece to a multi-million-dollar criminal puzzle. We drove back to David's secure downtown law office in absolute heavy silence, the quiet, steady hum of the car engine perfectly matching the intense, focused racing of my analytical mind. I was no longer the frightened, overwhelmed girl sitting on a freezing metal bench in a county jail cell. I was the silent architect of their complete and total destruction. When we reached the top floor of the prestigious law firm, David immediately locked his heavy mahogany office doors and closed the thick privacy blinds blocking out the morning sun. We cleared his massive oak desk, completely sweeping aside standard legal briefs and thick case files to make room for our makeshift war room. I opened my briefcase and gently placed the dark blue velvet box, the silver USB drive, and the weathered black notebook onto the polished wood surface. David carefully put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses and gently opened the fragile cover of my grandfather's ledger. For the next hour, we sat shoulder to shoulder meticulously analyzing the sheer tactical brilliance of the trap my grandfather had built during his final days. The ledger was an absolute masterclass in forensic financial documentation. My grandfather had recorded exact calendar dates, cross-referencing every single time Tyler entered the main secure vault with the exact moments high-value vintage watches were suddenly reported as severely damaged or completely lost. But my grandfather went even further down the rabbit hole. He had documented the corresponding sudden drops in the company operating accounts, noting exactly when Tyler used corporate emergency funds to cover the illegal shipping and shady logistics of moving his stolen luxury goods to black market dealers. David traced his finger slowly down a long column of numbers, shaking his head in absolute profound awe. "Your grandfather knew absolutely everything," David whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion and deep respect. He knew Tyler was actively fencing these irreplaceable masterpieces to cover his disgusting gambling debts, and he knew Linda was helping him doctor the quarterly expense reports to hide the massive financial bleeding from the board. He built a completely airtight federal case, and he left it right here for you to find, because he knew you were the only person smart enough to decipher the complex trail. I looked at the meticulous, shaky handwriting of a dying man and felt a fresh, warm wave of tears prick my eyes, but I quickly blinked them away. I did not have time to cry or mourn today. I had a massive, inescapable trap to set. I looked at David and told him it was officially time to make the call. We were not calling the local police precinct, who had blindly followed Tyler's fraudulent theft report without doing a single ounce of basic detective work. We were calling the people who handle massive corporate embezzlement and interstate wire fraud. David picked up his secure desk phone and directly dialed his personal contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crime Division. He placed the heavy black receiver on speakerphone, and the deep, booming, authoritative voice of Special Agent Reynolds filled the quiet office. David wasted absolutely no time on pleasantries. He clearly and methodically laid out the entire disturbing situation. He explained the fraudulent medical power of attorney, the highly staged theft of a $2.5 million corporate asset, the false police report filed by a malicious acting executive, and the deliberate criminal framing of a rightful heir to cover up multi-million-dollar embezzlement. Agent Reynolds sounded highly skeptical, at first naturally assuming this was just another messy, vindictive, rich family inheritance dispute. But then, David mentioned the concrete physical evidence. He told the federal agent, "We possessed crystal clear, high-definition dashcam footage of the current acting CEO purchasing a counterfeit luxury watch from a known underground replica dealer on the south side of Chicago, just hours before planting it in my apartment." I leaned forward toward the speakerphone and introduced myself. I told Agent Reynolds I was a certified forensic accountant and that I had the original handwritten ledgers cross-referenced with offshore bank transfers proving Tyler had systematically stolen over $4 million from sterling timepieces to pay off illegal gambling syndicates. The annoyed skepticism on the other end of the line instantly vanished completely, replaced by sharp professional interest. The FBI loves a neatly packaged financial crime, especially when an insider hands them the exact routing numbers and the undeniable video proof of evidence tampering. Agent Reynolds asked how quickly we could securely transmit the digital files. I had already copied the entire contents of the USB drive and my grandfather's ledger scans onto a secure encrypted cloud server. I hit send and watched the green progress bar fly across my laptop screen, instantly delivering the final heavy nails for Tyler's coffin directly to the federal government. 10 minutes later, Agent Reynolds called back, his voice completely changed. The casual tone was gone, entirely replaced by sharp, tactical precision. He confirmed the dashcam footage was a direct slam dunk for evidence tampering and filing a false federal report. The financial documents were more than enough to secure an immediate federal arrest warrant for grand larceny and corporate fraud. He asked where Tyler would be the following morning. I smiled a cold, incredibly ruthless smile. I told the agent that Tyler was hosting an emergency executive board meeting at 9 o'clock sharp at the Sterling Timepieces headquarters. Agent Reynolds promised he would have a full team of armed federal agents waiting quietly in the lobby before the meeting even began. The federal snare was officially set and waiting, but I still needed to make absolutely sure the rats walked happily right into the cage. Tyler and Linda were unbelievably arrogant, but they were also incredibly paranoid. If they suspected for even a single second that I was fighting back, or that their fake police report had fallen through, they might try to liquidate the remaining company accounts and immediately flee the country. I needed to feed their massive, fragile egos. I needed to make them truly believe their brutal jailhouse intimidation had completely broken my spirit and forced me into total submission. I opened my personal email account on my laptop and drafted a new message directly to Linda, making sure to heavily copy Tyler on the urgent thread. I stared at the blinking cursor, carefully choosing every single word to project total, absolute, pathetic defeat. I channeled the scared, exhausted 15-year-old girl they had thrown out into the freezing rain all those years ago. I typed out the subject line regarding the transfer of equity. My fingers flew across the keyboard, crafting a brilliant masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Linda, you win. I wrote, keeping the sentences short and sounding completely broken. I am completely terrified of going to federal prison. The police treated me like an absolute animal last night, and I cannot ever go back to that cold, dark cell. I am physically and mentally exhausted from fighting you. You were right about absolutely everything. I am just a simple accountant, and I have absolutely no idea how to run a massive luxury brand. I do not want any more fighting, and I do not want to destroy this family anymore. I agree to your exact terms from the visitation room. I will be at the headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I will stand in front of the entire executive board of directors, and I will formally publicly step down. I will sign the transfer of equity, and I will completely surrender all assets directly to Tyler. Please, just promise me you will call the police and tell them it was a misunderstanding so they drop the horrible charges against me. I just want to go back to my quiet, simple life and never see you again. I read the email twice, making sure it sounded pathetic enough to satisfy Linda's deeply twisted narcissistic need for absolute total control. It was the exact type of desperate begging she thrived on. She needed to feel like a powerful, majestic queen, granting generous mercy to a pathetic, lowly peasant. I moved the mouse over the send button and clicked it. The email vanished into cyberspace, flying directly into their greedy, impatient, waiting hands. I sat back in the heavy leather office chair and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension leave my shoulders. Less than 5 minutes later, a reply popped up on my glowing screen. It was from Linda. The response was incredibly brief, dripping with smug, toxic, overwhelming satisfaction. See you at 9, Jesse. Do not be late and wear something presentable. We have a company to run. I closed the laptop, shutting the silver lid with a sharp, immensely satisfying snap. They had completely swallowed the bait without a single second of hesitation. They truly believed I was going to walk into that massive glass boardroom, cry real tears in front of the senior executives, and hand them a multi-million-dollar luxury empire on a silver platter. They thought tomorrow morning was going to be their ultimate glorious public coronation. They had absolutely no idea they were actively throwing a massive, lavish party for their own spectacular, incredibly public funerals. I looked out the large office window at the bustling, busy Chicago streets below, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of calm wash over my tired body. The trap was perfectly, flawlessly set. The federal agents were fully briefed. The unarguable evidence was permanently secured. All I had to do now was go home, get a good night's sleep, and prepare to wear something incredibly presentable to watch my arrogant stepbrother leave his own triumphant board meeting in a pair of cold steel federal handcuffs. The heavy frosted glass doors of the Sterling Timepieces executive boardroom loomed in front of me like the gates of a fortress. It was exactly 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Just 24 hours ago, I had been shivering in a freezing county holding cell, utterly humiliated and branded a common criminal. Now I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of my grandfather's empire, preparing to deliver the greatest performance of my entire life. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, sterile air of the corporate hallway fill my lungs. I needed to completely suppress the burning fire of justice radiating inside my chest. I had to bury the fierce forensic accountant and perfectly channel the terrified, broken girl my family desperately wanted to see. I let my shoulders physically slump forward. I allowed my posture to cave inward, making myself look as small and defeated as humanly possible. I clutched a thick manila folder tightly against my chest with trembling hands. Inside that folder was the formal transfer of equity document they had demanded, but hidden directly beneath that single piece of paper were the high-resolution printed screenshots of Tyler's black market transaction and the devastating certified copies of my grandfather's hidden ledger. I reached out with a shaking hand and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The sprawling executive boardroom occupied the entire top floor corner of the building, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. But the incredible view was entirely overshadowed by the sickeningly celebratory atmosphere polluting the room. sitting dead center at the head of the massive polished mahogany table, occupying the exact leather chair my grandfather had commanded for 4 decades, was Tyler. He was wearing a ridiculously flashy, custom-tailored midnight blue suit with a bright crimson silk tie. A massive solid gold vintage watch gleamed on his wrist, undoubtedly a piece he had casually plucked from the active inventory that morning to celebrate his hostile takeover. He sat leaning back with his legs casually crossed, radiating the smug, arrogant energy of a man who believed he had just successfully conquered the world. Standing right beside him, pouring expensive champagne into crystal flutes, was Linda. She wore a pristine white designer suit, looking like a wealthy socialite hosting an exclusive charity gala, rather than a grieving widow finalizing the theft of a family business. The sharp, loud pop of a champagne cork echoed through the cavernous room just as I walked in, sounding like a gunshot. Linda laughed brightly, a harsh grating sound that grated against my nerves. She elegantly tipped the dark green bottle, filling the glasses with bubbling golden liquid. She was practically vibrating with toxic, joyous triumph. But the celebratory mood was entirely contained to just those two. Seated along the long sides of the mahogany table were the 7 senior members of the board of directors. These were distinguished veteran executives who had spent decades working directly alongside my grandfather. They were men and women who deeply respected the integrity and the profound heritage of sterling timepieces. They sat in absolute suffocating silence, staring down at their expensive leather portfolios or nervously sipping glasses of tap water. None of them touched the champagne Linda had so graciously placed in front of them. They looked incredibly, deeply uncomfortable. They knew my grandfather had just passed away. They knew I had spent 6 years working tirelessly in the trenches of the accounting department, keeping the company financially afloat. And they all knew about the scandalous, sudden police raid at my apartment last night. Tyler had undoubtedly briefed them early this morning, spinning a massive web of lies about my supposed mental breakdown and my desperate attempt to rob the company vault. The board members were completely trapped, bound by the fraudulent medical power of attorney Tyler wielded like a weapon. They looked at me with a mixture of quiet pity and profound confusion as I walked into the room. And then, there was my father. William sat at the absolute farthest end of the table, physically and emotionally distancing himself from the entire disgusting spectacle. He looked incredibly small. His shoulders were hunched tightly up to his ears, and his hands were folded tightly in his lap. He did not look up when the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind me. He did not look at Linda pouring the champagne, and he certainly did not look at Tyler, sitting in his own father's chair. William simply stared blankly at the polished wood grain of the floor directly beneath his expensive leather shoes. He was the ultimate enabling coward, silently permitting the complete destruction of his own daughter just to avoid a confrontation with his demanding wife. The sight of him staring pathetically at the floor completely killed any tiny lingering shred of sympathy I might have still harbored for him in my heart. "Ah, there she is," Tyler announced, his voice booming loudly across the silent room. He spread his arms wide in a grand theatrical gesture of mock welcome. "Right on time. Come in, Jessica. Please come take a seat. We have been waiting for you to wrap up this unfortunate little family mess." I forced my bottom lip to tremble violently. I kept my eyes pinned to the floor, taking slow, hesitant steps toward the empty chair positioned directly opposite Tyler at the far end of the table. I hugged the manila folder tighter against my chest, actively fighting the urge to stand up straight. I let a single hot tear spill over my eyelashes, allowing it to roll slowly down my cheek. It was not a difficult tear to summon. I just had to remember the freezing concrete bench in the county jail cell and the absolute terror of being handcuffed in my pajamas. Linda set the empty champagne bottle down on a silver tray and smiled at me with pure, venomous delight. "Good morning, Jessica," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern she always weaponized against me. "You look terribly exhausted, honey. I hope you managed to get at least a few hours of sleep after that horrifying ordeal with the police last night. It breaks my heart to see you struggling like this. But you are doing the right thing today. You're making the absolute best choice for your own mental health and for the protection of this family." I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, placing the manila folder gently onto the mahogany table. I did not speak. I simply kept my head bowed, letting my silence feed their massive, towering egos. Tyler leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. He looked around at the quiet, uncomfortable board members, making sure he had their complete, absolute attention before he delivered his final crushing blow. "Gentlemen," Tyler said, adopting a tone of fake corporate solemnity. "As you all know, my sister has been under a tremendous amount of psychological stress lately. The passing of our grandfather, coupled with the heavy pressures of the executive transition, proved to be entirely too much for her to handle. It culminated in an incredibly unfortunate incident last night, involving the police and missing corporate property. However, we are a family first and foremost. We have agreed to handle this internal tragedy privately and with the utmost discretion. Jessica has bravely decided to voluntarily step away from the company to focus on her recovery." He unlaced his fingers and reached into the inner pocket of his custom suit, pulling out a sleek, heavy gold fountain pen. He held it up, letting the morning light catch the expensive metal. "She is here today to formally surrender her shares and sign the total transfer of equity directly over to me." Tyler continued, his voice rising with absolute, undeniable glee. "This will permanently stabilize the company leadership and ensure that Sterling Timepieces moves forward without any further embarrassing distractions. We can officially close this dark chapter right now." Tyler tossed the gold pen casually across the long, polished table. The heavy metal spun across the mahogany wood, making a sharp scraping sound in the dead silence of the boardroom, before sliding to a perfect stop right in front of my manila folder. Tyler leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest and shooting me a completely victorious, mocking grin. He truly believed he had won. He believed the police report had completely shattered my defenses. He believed the threat of federal prison had forced me to crawl into this room and surrender my entire life. "Go ahead, little sister," Tyler gloated, his voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "Open the folder, sign on the dotted line. Give me the company and you can go back to your quiet, pathetic little life exactly like we agreed. Just sign the paper and this will all be over." I kept my head bowed for a long, agonizing moment, letting the heavy silence of the boardroom stretch until it became almost unbearable. Tyler was sitting at the head of the mahogany table, practically vibrating with arrogant impatience. He tapped his expensive custom shoes against the polished floor, waiting for me to pick up the gold fountain pen he had so casually tossed my way. Linda was hovering right behind him, her face glowing with the sickening anticipation of a predator finally cornering its prey. The 7 senior board members sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, watching me with quiet, pathetic pity. They truly believed they were witnessing the tragic final defeat of my grandfather's legacy. They had absolutely no idea they were about to witness its glorious resurrection. I slowly reached out my hand, allowing my fingers to tremble perfectly as they brushed against the smooth surface of the manila folder. I heard Linda let out a soft, satisfied breath. I slowly flipped the heavy paper cover open, but I did not reach for the transfer of equity document. I completely ignored the signature line that would have handed my entire life over to a degenerate gambler. Instead, my hand moved deeper into the folder. I slipped my fingers around the thick, worn leather of my grandfather's hidden black ledger. I pulled it out and set it down firmly on the center of the polished mahogany table. The dull thud of the heavy book echoed sharply in the quiet room. Tyler frowned, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "What is that, Jessica?" he demanded, his voice laced with sudden irritation. "Stop stalling and sign the paper." I ignored him entirely. I reached down into the heavy leather briefcase resting at my feet. I pulled out the antique polished mahogany box. I placed it directly on top of the black ledger right in the middle of the boardroom table. I looked up and locked eyes directly with my stepbrother. The terrified, broken girl he thought he had conquered was completely gone. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back, and raised my chin with absolute, undeniable authority. I reached out and slowly flipped the brass latch of the mahogany box. The lid popped open, revealing the pristine white satin interior. Resting perfectly inside, gleaming magnificently under the bright, harsh fluorescent boardroom lights, was the authentic $2.5 million vintage Vacheron Constantin. The collective gasp from the senior board members was absolutely deafening. They all instantly recognized the legendary timepiece. They knew my grandfather had considered it his ultimate masterpiece. But more importantly, they knew exactly what Tyler had told them just hours ago. Tyler had claimed the watch was stolen, recovered by the police, and currently sitting in a secure evidence locker down at the precinct. Tyler's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly, terrifying shade of absolute white. His jaw practically unhinged, his eyes bulging out of his head as he stared at the physical impossibility resting on the table. The smug, arrogant smirk was completely violently erased from his features, replaced by pure, unadulterated primal panic. Linda stumbled backward, her expensive white high heels slipping awkwardly against the polished wood floor. She clutched her chest, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging deeply into the fabric of her designer suit. Her mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, but absolutely no sound came out. William, my spineless, cowardly father, finally looked up from the floor. He stared at the gold watch and then stared at my face, completely paralyzed by the sudden massive shift in the atmosphere. "Where did you get that?" Tyler finally choked out his voice, cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic squeak. "That is impossible. That is a fake. You are trying to trick the board." I did not bother answering his pathetic lies. I turned away from the table and walked directly over to the massive digital presentation podium at the front of the room. I pulled the encrypted silver USB drive from my pocket and smoothly slotted it into the main computer terminal. I tapped the touchscreen, rapidly accessing the boardroom projector system. Above the mahogany table, a massive high-definition screen slowly descended from the ceiling, blocking out the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The room plunged into dramatic shadow as the heavy motorized blinds automatically lowered. I want the board of directors to see exactly what kind of man is currently sitting in my grandfather's chair. I announced, my voice ringing with cold, hard, absolute authority. My tone completely cut through the frantic whispering of the senior executives, commanding total silence. I hit the play button on the console. The massive screen flickered to life, immediately displaying the crystal-clear dashcam footage Jasmine had provided. The audio of the freezing Chicago rain filled the silent boardroom. Every single person in the room watched in absolute horror as the video clearly showed Tyler pulling his luxury car into the desolate, abandoned industrial park. They watched him step out into the rain, carrying his heavy leather briefcase. They watched with wide, disgusted eyes as their acting chief executive officer handed over massive stacks of stolen cash to a known street criminal. The camera perfectly captured the moment the criminal handed Tyler the dark blue velvet box. And then the screen showed Tyler sitting in the driver's seat, popping the box open and inspecting the incredibly detailed counterfeit Vacheron Constantin with a smug, relieved grin. "Stop it!" Tyler screamed, his voice echoing wildly with pure desperation. He slammed his fists down on the mahogany table, violently knocking over his crystal champagne flute. The golden liquid spilled everywhere, dripping onto the polished wood. "Turn that off right now, Jessica. That is heavily manipulated footage. That is a deepfake. She is lying to you all. She is trying to steal my company. Trying." I paused the video, leaving a massive high-definition image of Tyler's guilty, terrified face frozen on the projector screen for the entire board to see. I slowly walked back to the center of the table and placed my hand firmly on my grandfather's black ledger. "That footage was pulled directly from the internal hard drive of your own vehicle, Tyler." I stated, my voice perfectly calm and lethal. "Your own wife, Jasmine, provided it to me last night because she refuses to let your massive criminal incompetence destroy her pristine reputation. You did not recover a stolen watch. You bought a cheap black market replica, and you had your mother planted in my apartment so you could have me arrested for grand larceny. You orchestrated a massive fraudulent police raid to permanently silence me because you knew exactly what I was about to expose." I opened the black leather ledger and turned to the first heavily documented page. The senior board members leaned forward in their chairs, completely captivated by the overwhelming magnitude of the evidence. I looked directly at the oldest board member, an incredibly strict man named Arthur, who had been my grandfather's closest friend. "Arthur," I said, keeping my eye contact steady and unbreakable. For the last 6 months, my grandfather knew exactly what Tyler was doing behind his back. He knew his body was failing, but his mind was absolutely brilliant. He sat in his office and he quietly tracked every single discrepancy in the digital inventory servers. This ledger is his personal handwritten audit of Tyler's massive corporate embezzlement. I began systematically walking the board through the incredibly detailed forensic nightmare. I read out the exact dates when priceless vintage watches were falsely reported, permanently damaged, or completely destroyed by water leaks in the lower storage vaults. I cross-referenced those exact same dates with massive, unauthorized wire transfers draining the company operating accounts. I explained exactly how the offshore accounts were structured, using fake vendor invoices to siphon the liquidity out of our primary holding accounts. I detailed the specific gambling syndicates in Macau and Las Vegas that were receiving the wired funds. I pointed out the exact line items where Linda had authorized the falsified expense reports to artificially inflate the quarterly earnings and keep the board entirely in the dark. It was a massive, sophisticated bleeding of the company assets, and they had done it all while my grandfather was lying in a hospice bed, unable to physically intervene. Over the past 8 months, Tyler has systematically stolen $4.2 million from sterling timepieces, I announced, projecting my voice, so every single syllable struck them like a physical blow. He did not just forge inventory reports. He actively engaged in interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Linda fully enabled this behavior, doctoring the quarterly expense reports to hide the massive bleeding from this board of directors. My grandfather documented every single stolen cent in this ledger, knowing he would not live long enough to stop them himself. He left the authentic Vacheron Constantine securely locked in a private bank vault, and he left this ledger for me because he knew I would eventually finish the job. "Lies," Linda screeched, her voice finally breaking through her absolute shock. She lunged forward, her face distorted with ugly, desperate rage. "She is a jealous, psychotic liar. William, do something. Defend your son. Defend your family. Tell them she is crazy." William slowly looked up from the floor. He looked at Linda, screaming like a cornered animal. He looked at Tyler, sweating through his expensive custom suit, trembling with undeniable guilt. And then he looked at me standing tall and completely unbroken, holding my grandfather's legacy in my hands. William did not speak. He did not move to defend them. For the very first time in his entire miserable life, he simply lowered his head and silently accepted the massive, undeniable truth. Tyler scrambled out of his leather chair, backing away from the table like a completely cornered rat. His chest was heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for any possible exit. "You cannot prove anything," he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "You stole those documents. You hacked my car. You have absolutely no legal authority here. I am the acting chief executive officer. I have the medical power of attorney. I control this board." "Security," he screamed, waving his arms wildly toward the doors. "Call the building security and have this insane woman physically removed from my property immediately." None of the board members moved a single muscle. Arthur simply stared at Tyler with an expression of pure, absolute disgust, shaking his head slowly in complete silent condemnation. The entire room felt like a pressurized vacuum, completely sealed and waiting for the final explosive spark. "You do not control anything anymore, Tyler," I said, my voice completely steady, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of ultimate victory. "Your fraudulent power of attorney is completely void in the face of massive documented federal crimes, and you do not need to worry about calling the building security. I already made a few phone calls of my own this morning." Just as the words left my mouth, the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom were violently thrown open. The massive handles slammed hard against the interior walls, shattering the tense silence with a deafening crash. 6 tall, heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, strode directly into the room. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. Their expressions were completely stoic, radiating absolute zero tolerance for any corporate nonsense. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a deeply lined face and piercing gray eyes, walked straight past the frozen board members and marched directly toward the head of the table. He did not look at the expensive champagne. He did not look at the panoramic city view. He locked his hard, steady gaze entirely on my terrified, sweating stepbrother. Tyler Sterling, the lead agent, barked his deep, authoritative voice echoing off the glass walls of the massive room. "We have a signed federal warrant for your immediate arrest." The moment the lead federal agent spoke those words, absolute total chaos erupted inside the pristine executive boardroom. Tyler shot up from my grandfather's leather chair, so fast it crashed violently to the floor behind him. He began frantically backing away, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt to ward off the heavily armed men advancing on him. "You have no right," he screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek. "I am the acting chief executive officer of this company. Call my lawyer. Call my entire legal team right now. This is a massive misunderstanding." The lead FBI agent did not even blink. He had seen hundreds of arrogant white-collar criminals completely crumble, and Tyler was absolutely no different. He simply stepped forward, grabbed Tyler's expensive custom-tailored sleeve, spun him around forcefully and aggressively, slammed him face-first into the polished mahogany table. The crystal champagne flutes shattered instantly, sending incredibly sharp shards of expensive glass and bubbling golden liquid flying everywhere across the boardroom. Tyler writhed and kicked, screaming completely incoherent, panicked threats as the cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. He was no longer the smug, arrogant billionaire who thought he could casually steal my family legacy. He was just a pathetic, desperate criminal, caught completely red-handed by his own staggering arrogance. Linda completely lost her mind. The perfectly manicured, wealthy socialite facade entirely melted away, revealing the absolute vicious monster hiding underneath. She let out an unhinged, blood-curdling scream that sounded exactly like a cornered, feral animal. She lunged directly across the massive boardroom table, her hands hooked into desperate claws, aiming straight for my face. "You ruined us, you ungrateful little witch!" she shrieked, her face twisted into a horrifying mask of pure, ugly hatred. "I will kill you, Jessica. I will completely destroy your life." But she never even came close to touching me. Before her expensive white heels could clear the shattered crystal glass, two massive building security guards, who had quietly followed the federal agents inside, grabbed her arms and violently yanked her backward. Linda thrashed wildly, kicking her legs and spitting pure toxic venom as they dragged her aggressively away from the table. Her pristine white designer suit was completely ruined, covered in spilled sticky champagne and her own desperate sweat. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of all her false power and completely reduced to a screaming, frantic mess in front of the entire executive board, who watched her meltdown with complete, absolute disgust. In the middle of this absolute hurricane of federal arrests and shattered glass, my father finally broke. William fell heavily to his knees right there on the corporate carpet, completely ignoring his hysterical, screaming wife and his handcuffed stepson. He crawled pathetically toward me, heavy, thick tears streaming freely down his pale, aging face. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my suit jacket. "Jessica, please," he sobbed, his voice thick with heavy, pathetic regret. "Please, sweetheart, you have to stop this right now. You are my daughter. I am so sorry. I was blind. I was a terrible coward. I let them manipulate me, but I love you. Please forgive me. We can fix this as a family. We can start over." I looked down at the man who was supposed to protect me my entire life. I searched my heart for any lingering warmth, but I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, aching hole in my chest that had desperately craved a father's love for almost 30 years was completely, permanently sealed shut. I took a deliberate, careful step backward, pulling my jacket safely out of his desperate, trembling reach. I looked him dead in his weeping red eyes and delivered the final crushing truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. "You stopped being my father the day you watched them put me in handcuffs. I stated my voice perfectly cold and absolutely devoid of any emotion. You stood by silently and let them throw me in a freezing concrete cage for a crime I did not commit, just so you would not have to stand up to your miserable wife. You do not have a daughter anymore, William. You are absolutely nothing to me. Before my weeping father could even process the absolute crushing finality of my words, the shattered frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open one last time. The entire frantic room briefly fell completely silent as Jasmine calmly walked in. She looked absolutely magnificent. She wore a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit, her posture radiating pure, undeniable, fierce authority. She did not look at the screaming Linda being hauled toward the freight elevators. She did not look at the weeping William kneeling pathetically on the floor. She walked with slow, deliberate, measured steps directly over to where Tyler was currently being hauled up from the table by the federal agents. Tyler looked at her, his tear-stained, bruised face lighting up with a brief, pathetic flash of hope. "Jasmine, honey, you have to call our lawyers," he begged desperately, struggling against the heavy steel chains binding his wrists. "Tell them this is all a massive mistake. Tell them I am an innocent man being framed by a jealous sister." Jasmine stopped right in front of him. Her expression was a terrifying, brilliant masterclass in absolute icy composure. She slowly, deliberately reached up with her right hand and slid the massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band entirely off her finger. She dropped the heavy, expensive jewelry directly onto the mahogany table right next to the fake Vacheron Constantine. The rings landed with a sharp, loud, metallic clink that echoed perfectly in the silent room. Next, she reached calmly into her sleek black leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents, dropping them directly onto Tyler's chest. "Those are your formal divorce papers," Jasmine said, her voice echoing with lethal, crystal-clear precision, cutting through the remaining tension in the room. "I have already completely frozen every single joint bank account we share. I am taking the primary residential estate. I am taking full complete custody of my real estate firm, and I am taking absolutely every single remaining asset to cover the immense financial damages your pathetic illegal gambling addiction has caused my pristine reputation. Have fun rotting in federal prison, Tyler. Do not ever attempt to contact me again." It has been exactly 365 days since I watched the federal agents escort my screaming stepbrother out of the executive boardroom. Today, I am sitting at the absolute center of the massive mahogany table in the corner office of Sterling Timepieces, but the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the past is completely gone. I replaced my grandfather's old leather chair with something modern and sleek, a physical representation of the new era I have ushered in. Under my direct leadership as the sole chief executive officer, the company has not just stabilized, it has absolutely flourished. We completely severed all ties with the shady overseas shell companies and redirected our massive capital into authentic global expansion. We just opened our third international boutique in Geneva last month, and our quarterly profits have entirely shattered every single historical record my grandfather ever set. The terrified little accountant they tried to bully into submission is currently running a global luxury empire with absolute precision. While my life has expanded beautifully, the lives of the people who tried to destroy me have shrunk into tiny, miserable cages. Tyler is currently serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy when the prosecution presented the dashcam footage, the fake police reports, and the undeniable proof of his multi-million-dollar wire fraud. There are no custom-tailored midnight blue suits or vintage gold watches where he is now. He is just another federal inmate completely stripped of his arrogant billionaire persona, wearing a cheap uniform and living precisely on the strict schedule dictated by the prison guards. He tried to lock me in a cell for 15 years to cover his massive gambling debts, and now he is spending the prime decade of his life staring at concrete walls. Linda's massive, spectacular downfall was equally satisfying. When Tyler was convicted, all of his assets were completely frozen and seized to pay federal restitution. Because Linda had actively helped him doctor the corporate expense reports, the civil litigation completely drained whatever personal wealth she had managed to hoard. She is currently drowning in a massive ocean of inescapable legal debt. The woman who used to wear pristine white designer suits and pour $1,000 champagne in corporate boardrooms is now working 35 hours a week as a cashier at a discount retail store in a rundown suburban strip mall. I heard through the grapevine that she complains constantly to anyone who will listen about how she was robbed of her high society life. She is a completely broken, bitter woman living entirely in the miserable reality she built for herself. And then there is William. My father lives completely alone in a tiny rented apartment on the edge of the city. Every single month, without fail, a handwritten letter arrives at the corporate headquarters addressed to me. He writes long, desperate pages, begging for forgiveness, claiming he was blinded by his horrible wife, and asking for just one more chance to be a real father. Every single month, my executive assistant takes that thick envelope, marks it return to sender, and drops it right back into the outgoing mail completely unopened. He made his absolute final choice when he stared at his shoes while Linda plotted to send me to a federal prison. You cannot actively participate in the destruction of your own child and then expect an invitation to the victory party. The only beautiful relationship that actually bloomed from the ashes of that horrible morning is my incredible bond with Jasmine. After she dropped those divorce papers on the boardroom table and walked away, she completely legally eviscerated Tyler in court. She took total, unyielding custody of her real estate empire and forced him to liquidate his remaining personal assets to cover his debts to her firm. We meet for coffee every other Tuesday morning before our respective board meetings. We are two fiercely independent, highly successful women who looked at a toxic, crumbling empire and chose to burn the rot to the ground instead of letting it consume us. Jasmine and I completely thrive in our new reality, constantly reminding each other that the most powerful thing a woman can ever do is refuse to be a victim. If I could go back in time to talk to that exhausted, terrified 15-year-old girl standing in the freezing rain after her family threw her away, I would tell her exactly how this story ends. I would tell her that she does not need their toxic conditional love to build a beautiful, successful life. Because the most important lesson I learned through all of this pain is that family is absolutely not about blood. Family is entirely about respect. It is about the people who stand fiercely beside you when the entire world is trying to tear you down. When toxic people try to back you into a dark corner, do not cry. Do not shrink yourself to make them feel comfortable, and do not ever surrender your power just to keep a false sense of peace. You audit them. You quietly gather your undeniable evidence, you trust your own incredible strength, and you use the absolute truth as your ultimate weapon. You must never apologize for fiercely protecting your own peace. If you found genuine satisfaction in seeing these entitled, arrogant bullies get exactly what they deserved, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. It truly helps these important stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. I would absolutely love to hear from you today. What exactly would you have done if your own toxic family tried to frame you for a massive crime? Would you have set a corporate trap or handled it differently? Drop your honest thoughts along with the city and the exact time you are watching this video down in the comments section below. I love reading every single one of your incredible responses. Remember, your personal boundaries are your absolute greatest power. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.